Chapter 446. The king of Shu turned his head and happened to see Li Yi stop in his tracks. He saw Li Yi's face change dramatically. Li Yi's face turned pale and his body trembled slightly, looking extremely frightened. Is this the important minister that my father valued? Is this the legendary Li Xianzi who created the national treasure? Is this the person whom the old generals protected at the risk of offending the future emperor? At this moment, the king of Shu began to doubt whether there was really a king's aura. Otherwise, why would Li Yi be so frightened at the sight of him? Li Xianzi, where are you going? The king of Shu said lightly with a sarcastic smile on his face. Li Yi's breathing was rapid and his chest was heaving up and down. If he raised his head, the king of Shu would definitely see his bloodshot eyes. He walked up to the king of Shu and punched him hard in the face. F***CKU. Plop. The king of Shu's sarcastic smile was still on his face, but his body fell to the ground. However, it was not over yet. Li grabbed his collar and punched his face again and again. He didn't care even if the blood splattered on his body. King of Shu, Crown Prince? You're very arrogant, aren't you? Get up and talk to me if you have guts. Princess Yongning sat on the ground in a daze. She looked at the scene in front of her and forgot to cry for a moment. The two eunuchs behind the king of Shu stood rooted to the ground, their faces full of astonishment. The person lying on the ground, whose original face could no longer be recognized, was the honorable king of Shu, and the person who punched him again and again in a crazed manner and said strange words was Li Xianzi, who was frightened by the king of Shu and fell ill. Who the hell made up this rumor? This thought flashed in the minds of the two eunuchs. They had no time to greet the ancestors of the rumor monger. If they continued to beat him, he would die. If the king of Shu died, their lives would not be far from the end. The two eunuchs hurriedly squatted down and wanted to pull Li Xianzi away. However, they were greeted with two knife-hand strikes. After blacking out, they collapsed to the ground. Future crown prince? Proficient in both literary and military strategies. F***CKU. The usual indifference could no longer be seen on Li Yi's face. Instead, it was replaced by endless ferocity and madness. The king of Shu's reputation of being well-versed in both the pen and the sword was just a boast. At this moment, he could not break free from Li Yi's grasp at all. He was drowned in humiliation and pain. In the distance, a figure was hiding behind a certain palace, watching the scene unfold before him with endless fear on his face. This was the result of bullying Yongning. Prince Jean, Li Han's forehead was full of cold sweat. He suddenly felt that he was very lucky. The numbers and symbols that he hated just now suddenly became very cute. Die. I want all of you to die. The king of Shu's face was covered in blood. He was so enraged that his eyes were about to pop out of their sockets. He pointed a trembling finger at Li Yi and enunciated each word clearly. He had never suffered such humiliation before. If he had only wanted to suppress and humiliate Li Yi after he ascended to the throne, now he could only appease his anger by watching him die. Tilting his head to look at Princess Xiaoning, Li Yi finally smiled. This was the first time he smiled from the bottom of his heart in recent days. He was already feeling vexed about being involved in the affairs of the imperial court. Now that he had encountered this special day of the year, he felt lonely and empty. All sorts of emotions intertwined together. However, all the emotions that he had accumulated for a long time were vented the moment he heard the word beautiful sheep and the moment his fist landed on the king of Shu's face. Don't worry, you won't have this chance. Li Yi turned to look at him and shook his head seriously. The king of Shu only felt a fist growing larger in his eyes. Then, his vision turned black again, followed by intense pain. Stop! Mingzu, who followed closely behind, saw the king of Shu lying on the ground and Li Yi in a crazed state. Her expression changed drastically. She immediately reached out to grab Li Yi's shoulder. However, when Li Yi turned around and she saw his bloodshot eyes, her hand paused for a moment and she didn't touch him in the end. The ribs in Li Xian's mouth had long fallen to the ground. However, he only paused for a moment before he made up his mind. He kicked the king of shoes, and officially joined the fight. The inhumane screams soon attracted the attention of the court officials. When they followed the direction of the sound, they saw Li Xianzi, who they had seen in the morning, punching and kicking an unknown object lying on the ground. They were so shocked that their jaws almost dropped. In broad daylight, in front of the court officials, he dared to commit murder in the palace. He was simply lawless. Was His Majesty really muddle-headed? How could he hand over the position of Minister of War to such a person? Wait, who was the person beside Li Xianzi? It seemed to be Li Xian, the supervisor of Jiangyi province, the crown prince of Ning. The figure standing at the side, watching the fight, also looked a little familiar. It was Princess Royal. Although the face of the unknown object lying on the ground could not be seen clearly, the clothes and body shape seemed a little familiar. A princess, a crown prince, and a lord were actually putting on such a big show in the palace. The court officials suddenly felt as if there were 10,000 horses galloping in their hearts. Such a big commotion naturally could not escape the attention of the palace guards. Before the court officials could approach, a group of guards rushed over. They were about to draw their weapons, but after Mingzu gave them a cold stare, they just surrounded the place. Several people immediately went up to pull Li Yi and Li Xian away. Although fighting in the palace was a serious crime, one was the crown prince, and the other had a special status. No matter how bold the guard captain was, he did not dare to use violence against a superior of the Secret Intelligence Office. He did not know which unlucky guy had offended both of them at the same time. He was afraid that this beating would be in vain. This unlucky guy was His Highness, the King of Shu. Looking at the guy lying on the ground who had fainted, the guard captain vaguely recognized a familiar face. He immediately gasped, and his heart was in his throat. Oh no, this matter has become serious. Quick, summon the imperial physician. The guard captain said hurriedly, then turned around and calmly ordered, arrest Li Xianzi and Crown Prince Li Xian. Looking at His Highness, who was in a terrible state, the guard captain knew that today's matter was no longer something that he could handle. Go and report to His Majesty. The palace guards were perceptive. Although their leader's order was to capture them, they only surrounded the two of them and did not make any rude movements. Why are you so nervous? We won't run away. Li Xian clapped his hands and said, curling his lips. When the unknown object was carried by two guards and rushed to the imperial physician, the officials who had left the court finally saw his full appearance. It's His Highness, the King of Shu. After seeing the object clearly, several officials immediately lost their balance and fell to the ground. The person that Li Xianzi and Crown Prince Li Xian just beat up was actually His Highness, the King of Shu. Thinking of the scene just now, the people thought to themselves, if it were not for his clothes and figure, even the imperial concubine would not have recognized him just by looking at his face. What followed was a monstrous uproar. Chapter 447. Just now, that was really the King of Shu. What a scandal. What a scandal. Assaulting a prince is outrageous. He's simply out of control. A fight in the palace, and the target was a prince with a very sensitive status and identity. This was the first time since the founding of the Jing Kingdom. Even during the reign of Emperor Taizu, such an atrocious incident had never happened in the palace. The officials who were close to the King of Shu were shocked and angry. All of them were filled with righteous indignation and wished they could hack Li Yi into pieces. In recent days, the King of Shu's reputation in the imperial court had declined. He had lost face in front of His Majesty and even the officials. Now, he didn't care about the little face he had lost. He was beaten unconscious and carried away by the guards with his face covered with blood. How could he have any face left? Even if His Highness ascended the throne in the future, this incident would never be erased from the history books. Although the other officials were not so angry, they couldn't help thinking of the rumors about Li Xianzi and the King of Shu in recent days. Li Xianzi was so frightened by a few words from the King of Shu. Was he worried that the King of Shu would settle accounts with him after he ascended the throne? Nonsense. This was a bunch of nonsense. Was he as cowardly as the rumors said when he beat the king of Shu just now? Thinking of that madness and ruthlessness, they still felt a chill in their hearts. The king of Shu would probably never forget today's shadow for the rest of his life. Li couldn't hear or see the uproar of the officials and the frightened eyes of the surrounding guards. The sound around him seemed to be isolated by an invisible barrier. Because of the large amount of exercise just now, his chest was slightly heaving up and down. However, he didn't have time to wipe the sweat on his forehead. His eyes passed over the palace guard surrounding him and fell on a small figure. When he saw that silly but extremely friendly little face, Li felt joy and relief that he had never felt before. He smiled again, but it was this kind and warm smile that caused the surrounding guards to feel a chill in their hearts. Did he know what was waiting for him after beating the king of Shu to such a state? How could he still smile in this situation? This Li Xianzi must be crazy. In the Hall of Longevity, Emperor Jing had just taken his medicine and was lying on the soft mattress, preparing to rest for an hour before getting up to read the important memorials. The imperial physicians of the Imperial Physician Bureau had advised him many times not to overwork himself. Otherwise, his condition would worsen. Emperor Jing, who had never cared about this advice, finally realized that his body was not as good as it used to be after the previous incident. After just a short morning court session, he felt a little tired. He could only sigh inwardly and temporarily put all his worries to the back of his mind to rest. His Majesty has just fallen asleep. If there's anything, please wait until His Majesty wakes up. We really have an urgent matter. Please inform His Majesty. The unit guarding the door and the two palace guards were arguing over something. Shut up. Changda's figure had unknowingly floated to their side as he spoke coldly. Chief Steward Chang. The two guards hurriedly bowed. Changda looked at the two of them and said indifferently, "What happened? Speak." There were imperial guards in the palace, so what could happen? As long as the rebels did not invade the imperial city, nothing was more important than His Majesty's health. Seeing Chief Steward Chang speak, a guard immediately said, "Chief Steward Chang, County Magistrate Li Yi and Crown Prince Li Xian just beat up the King of Shu in the palace. The King of Shu was seriously injured and has been sent to the Imperial Physician Bureau. We have arrested County Magistrate Li and Crown Prince Li and are waiting for His Majesty's punishment." The indifference on Changda's face disappeared. He suddenly looked at the guard and said, "What did you say? Say it again." After His Majesty said, "If there's something, report to me. If there's nothing, dismiss the court session." It did not mean that the officials could go home and beat their children. Usually, after the court session ended, most of the officials had to return to their posts and continue their work. If there was nothing, they would hold a small meeting to convey the spirit of the morning court session to their subordinates and implement His Majesty's instructions. But today was different. Many officials in the 3 provinces, 6 ministries, and 24 departments were not busy with their work. They gathered in 2s and 3s and whispered something. "Have you heard that the King of Shu was beaten up in the palace today?" A gossipy assistant minister from the Ministry of Works said mysteriously while pouring water. "What? No way. This is the Imperial Palace. How could the King of Shu?" Hearing this, the 2 leaders were shocked, and they immediately came over. The assistant minister looked around and did not see the minister. He immediately felt relieved and described what he had seen on the way down to the imperial court session with exaggerated details. For a moment, there were endless exclamations in the duty room. The officials who were further away also stopped what they were doing and looked at the assistant minister with puzzled and curious eyes. The imperial palace was the most heavily guarded place in the country. It had been peaceful for decades, just like the surface of a calm lake. There was rarely any big news. The calmer the lake was, the bigger the ripples would be when a huge stone was thrown into it. That was because the incident happened when hundreds of officials went down to the imperial court session. The miserable condition of the King of Shu was witnessed by countless people. A layer of ripples easily became layers of ripples. Have you heard that the King of Shu was beaten up in the imperial palace? It was Li Xianzi and Crown Prince Li Xian. They even dared to beat the King of Shu. They are really audacious. You all know about the matter between the king of Shu and Li Xianzi. It seems that the king of Shu forced Li Xianzi too much and drove him crazy. What's there to be afraid of? It's said that the king of Shu would have been beaten to death today if the imperial guards hadn't discovered it in time. No. I heard that the king of Shu and Crown Prince Li Xian had a quarrel and were beaten up by them. After all, everyone knows that the king of Shu has been plotting against the Wang family for a long time. Unexpectedly, Crown Prince Li Xian intervened at the critical moment. Today, they met in the imperial palace and started to fight. However, the king of Shu was not as skilled as them. I heard that he is still in the imperial physician's office, and his life and death are unknown. Li Mingze, the assistant minister of the Ministry of Personnel, stood at the door and coughed. Several officials who were whispering to each other turned around and their expressions changed. They immediately returned to their original positions and pretended to handle official business. Li Xianzi was the nephew of the assistant minister. This matter should not be mentioned here. A trace of deep worry flashed in Li Mingze's eyes. This time, Li Yi really made a big trouble. Not to mention him, except for the emperor, no one could intervene in this matter. This little guy has always been calm. Why is he so reckless this time? Outside the Hall of Diligent Government, several old generals gathered together. Seeing that Li Yi and Li Xian were taken in by the imperial guards, they frowned deeply. Fighting in the palace was a serious crime, let alone beating up a prince. However, this was different from the written law. It was up to the emperor to decide whether to be beheaded by 1,000 cuts or lightly beaten with a few planks of the board. Fortunately, according to their understanding of the emperor, it was impossible to behead him. Since the emperor valued him so much, he would definitely not punish him severely. Moreover, this matter also involved Crown Prince Li Xian, so it was even more difficult to punish him. However, hundreds of officials in the imperial court were present. Under the watchful eyes of so many people, the two of them had beaten the king of Shu so miserably. It was not easy to overlook this matter. The officials of the king of Shu and the imperial censor would not let go of this opportunity. The imperial censor and the imperial censor would not let go of this opportunity. The imperial consort was even more difficult to deal with. In short, this time, he was going to suffer some hardships. This day was a very ordinary day for the commoners in the capital. The only regret was that it was cloudy in the morning. They thought that there would be a heavy rain to dispel the summer heat. Unexpectedly, it cleared up before noon. It seemed that they would not be able to cool down for the next few days. However, the families of the officials and lords with a little bit of status were shaken by a certain news from the palace. Chapter 448. Haha, I would like to see how that Li Yi will escape this calamity. In the Duke of Chun residence, Chun Chong stepped into the residence with a smile on his face. This caused the servants in the residence to feel puzzled. Did the sun rise from the west today? The second master, who usually treated others with disdain, was actually smiling so happily. A few coughs came from hall in front of them. Chun Qing, who had taken a leave of absence due to illness, walked out. Seeing the laughing Chun Chong, he asked in confusion, "What happened in court today for you to be so happy?" A moment later, after hearing Chun Chong describe what he had seen in the palace today, a hint of shock involuntarily appeared on Chun Qing's pale face. "Is this true? It's true. It can't be any more true. At that time, I was watching from afar. This is him seeking his own death. He can't blame us." Chun Chong laughed loudly and said, "I will immediately write a memorial of impeachment." Under the eyes of the public, all the officials saw it. This time, even His Majesty will not be able to protect him. At the corner of the corridor on the right, the prayer beads in the white-haired lady's hand were broken, and the beads fell to the ground. The same scene was happening in the homes of many officials. In an instant, innumerable impeachment memorials flew toward the imperial palace like snowflakes, and innumerable people's jaws dropped in shock. To the Wang family. In the Crown Prince's residence, the Crown Prince's consort, who had just received the news, paled. She hurriedly boarded a carriage and left the residence. In the Li residence, The old madam had an anxious expression. She immediately had the servants prepare the visiting cards and send them to the various noble families in the capital. In the Viscount's residence, the bruised Fong sat on the stone steps in front of the door, staring at the sky in a daze. With such an evil woman in the house, these days were truly unbearable. Suddenly, the sound of hooves came from the end of the road. Fong turned his head and saw a fast horse galloping in his direction. "Son-in-law has been a little unhappy these past few days," Xiao Huan murmured, her hands supporting her chin as she looked at the young mistress and second young mistress. There was a hint of worry on Rui's face. As the closest person to Li Yi, she could naturally notice the changes in Li Yi these days, but she didn't know what she could do. Mississippi Lu leaned against the table with her sword in her arms. There was no expression on her face. She frowned as she thought of the words and emotions that Li Yi said that she couldn't understand. "Young mistress, something bad has happened." Fong's panicked voice sounded outside the door, and the three women turned their heads at the same time. "Your Majesty, you must seek justice for Xian'er." A woman in a palace dress grabbed Emperor Jing's arm and said through gritted teeth, "My poor son, he was almost beaten to death by him. That Li Yi must pay with his life. Also, that Li Xian, we can't let him off easily." The woman wearing the phoenix coronet slowly stood up. She looked at Imperial Consort Shui and said, "Sister, before this matter is fully investigated, you should calm down." "How can I calm down? How can I calm down? My son has become like that. How can Her Majesty want me to calm down?" Thinking of the miserable appearance of her son in the Imperial Physician's office, Imperial Consort Shui showed a fierce expression and said fiercely, "Don't talk." Emperor Jing waved his hand and asked the Imperial Physician, Lu Jimin, who had been standing by for a long time, "How is the King of Shu?" The Imperial Physician bowed and said, "Your Majesty, the King of Shu has a broken nose and 3 ribs. There are many bruises all over his body, but fortunately, his life is not in danger. I have already set the bones for the King of Shu. If he wants to recover, I'm afraid he will have to rest for a few months." Emperor Jing frowned. This matter was really beyond his expectation. Although Li didn't seem to be steady at all, he was definitely not reckless. Why did he suddenly beat a prince in the palace? What kind of stimulation did he receive to make him lose his composure like this? How was the investigation going? Emperor Jing said faintly, and Changda's figure appeared in the palace like a ghost. "It's all clear." Changda nodded and waved his hand in the direction of the palace door. He said loudly, "Let them in." 2 eunuchs walked in with pale faces. They knelt on the ground and said loudly, "Your servants greet His Majesty, Her Majesty, and Imperial Consort." Emperor Jing waved his hand and said, "Get up. Tell me everything you saw just now. Don't hide anything." Even if His Majesty didn't say it, they didn't dare to hide anything. The 2 eunuchs immediately described everything that they had seen in detail, including the few words that the King of Shu had whispered to Emperor Jing on the way. They did not omit any of it. Hearing the 2 eunuchs say that the King of Shu first bullied Princess Yongning, Imperial Consort Shui's face changed. Then she flew into a rage and screamed, "Nonsense! Bully Princess Yongning? How could Xian'er be such a person? How dare you all deceive His Majesty and this consort? Do you all not want your heads anymore?" The 2 eunuchs thought that Imperial Consort Shui didn't know what kind of person her son was. They looked up at Emperor Jing and hurriedly knelt on the ground. They said, "Your Majesty, Her Majesty, everything I said is true. If there is any falsehood, let me be struck by lightning and die a horrible death." Emperor Jing frowned and said, "Go on." The 2 eunuchs obeyed and told how the King of Shu bullied Princess Yongning and how Li Xianzi suddenly went crazy. They went forward to stop him and were knocked out by Li Xianzi. After that, they didn't know what happened. After listening to what happened, Changda was expressionless, but the eyes of the Imperial Physician, Lu Jimin, flashed a few times. The Empress looked at Imperial Consort Shui and said coldly, "As an adult prince, he actually bullied a 6-year-old girl. Sister, you taught your son well." A trace of panic flashed across Imperial Consort Shui's face. She hurriedly said, even if Xian'er was wrong first, His Majesty should punish him. What kind of person is that Li Yi? He actually dared to offend his superior. He really deserves to die. Suddenly went crazy? Emperor Jing couldn't figure out why Li Yi suddenly went crazy. He had always been very accurate in judging people. He thought that he knew Li Yi very well, but he still couldn't figure it out. Your Majesty, I have something to say. At this moment, a voice came from the side. Emperor Jing looked at the imperial physician, Lu Jimin, who stood out and nodded slightly to him. Before that, may I ask them a question? Lu Jimin pointed to the two eunuchs and said. Seeing Emperor Jing nod again, Lu Jimin looked at the two eunuchs and asked, when did Li Xianzi go crazy? I remember that at that time, the king of Shu kicked Princess Yongning's doll into the lotus pond. The little princess cried and said, give me back my beautiful sheep. After hearing this, Li Xianzi suddenly went crazy. He punched the king of Shu's face, and then a eunuch recalled and said. The other eunuch nodded repeatedly. Yes, Li Xianzi went crazy after hearing the little princess's words. The two described the details of the king of Shu's beating in detail. As for Li Xianzi's go to hell, they wisely chose to hide it. Lu Jimin turned his head, bowed and said, Your Majesty, I have finished my questions. Emperor Jing looked at him and said doubtfully, Is this related to Li Xianzi's madness? Your Majesty is wise. Lu Jimin flattered Emperor Jing first, and then said, Your Majesty, according to my speculation, Li Xianzi should suffer from a rare hysteria. He usually does not show it, but if he is stimulated by some special things, he will immediately lose his mind and do some extremely crazy things. Your Majesty should know that Li Xianzi was seriously ill a few days ago. Your Majesty ordered me to go to the Viscount's mansion to treat Li Xianzi. At that time, I found some clues, but I was not sure. Now it seems that there should be something in the little princess's words that can stimulate Li Xianzi. Beautiful sheep? Emperor Jing said in surprise. He could not help but think of the doll that Yongning often held in her hands. It was personally sewn by concubine Liang when she was alive. After concubine Liang passed away, Yongning would often see Yongning holding it. Of course, at that time, her temperament was not so eccentric. Ever since she had a serious illness at the age of 5, she became demented. She never opened her mouth to speak and only knew how to hold the doll in a daze. It was not until now that Emperor Jing knew that the doll was called Beautiful Sheep, and this word could stimulate Li Yi's sudden hysteria. Imperial concubine Shui suddenly realized that the topic of their discussion had deviated from the main topic. What they were discussing now was not whether Li Yi was hysterical or not, but how to seek justice for her son. Concubine Shui glared at Lu Jimin fiercely and said, Your Majesty, he is exonerating Li Yi. How can there be such a disease in this world? Lu Jimin said unhurriedly, Although this disease is rare, there are many records in medical books. If Your Majesty and concubine Liang doubt it, you can send someone to check it out. His expression was very indifferent, and there was no sign of guilt. As an imperial physician, even if he was talking nonsense, there was a theoretical basis. If she wanted to refute him on this point, concubine Liang was still too young. Emperor Jing thought for a moment and said, Someone, go and bring that beautiful sheep to me. Changde waved his hand, and 2 guards immediately went out to carry out the order. Imperial concubine Shui anxiously said, Your Majesty, even if Li Yi is suffering from hysteria, we can't let him off so easily. There's also that Li Xian. When did Xian'er offend him for him to be so heavy-handed? Princess Yongla just watched from the side and didn't stop him. They're all targeting Xian'er. There must be some conspiracy behind this. Your Majesty must investigate this matter thoroughly. Emperor Jing glanced at concubine Shui. There was no conspiracy in this matter. Li Yi and Li Xian were simply wearing the same pair of pants. Mingzu did not hesitate to deceive her father and count on them to help the king of Shu. Wasn't she hoping that the sun would rise from the west? I will make a fair decision on this matter. The king of Shu will stay in the palace to recuperate these days. Send an imperial physician to accompany him. Concubine Shui, go back and wait first. The rest of you, follow me to the Hall of Diligent Government. Emperor Jing said lightly and walked out of the hall. The Hall of Diligent Government was the place where Emperor Jing usually reviewed memorials and dealt with state affairs. Li Yi and Li Xian were now locked up here. Li Xian walked back and forth in the hall with a worried expression on his face. He was not worried about what kind of punishment he would receive for beating up the king of Shu, but he was worried about Li Yi. Since he was locked up here, he had been leaning against the pillar and giggling alone. He never responded to him when he talked to him. He did not know if he was possessed by evil spirits or was suffering from hysteria. Hey, what's wrong with you? Li Xian stretched out his palm and waved it in front of his eyes, but he still did not get any response. When he couldn't help but reach out and pinch him, there was finally a movement at the door. Li Xian looked back and hurried over. He said respectfully, Li Xian greets your majesty and your highness. The empress took his hand and looked him up and down. She asked with concern, Xianer, how are you? Are you hurt? No, Li Xian said with some embarrassment. Emperor Jing glanced at him and asked, where is Li Yi? Li Xian pointed to the pillar not far away, awkwardly. Emperor Jing strode over. When he saw Li Yi's appearance, he could not help but be shocked. Was what imperial physician Lu said true? Your Majesty, after seeing County Magistrate Li, I feel that my guess is almost right. Imperial physician Lu thought that County Magistrate Li was indeed County Magistrate Li. His cooperation and acting skills were simply flawless. Boldly, do you know your crime? Emperor Jing looked at him and suddenly said coldly. Li had a faint smile on his face. He seemed to be completely immersed in his own world and was not moved at all. The atmosphere in the hall was a little awkward for a while. Ahem. Emperor Jing coughed, and his old face could not help but turn red. Your Majesty, you can't wake County Magistrate Li like this. Lu Jimin hurried forward and stretched out his hands to slap in front of Li Yi's eyes. He said loudly, County Magistrate Li, what is a beautiful sheep? Li Yi's body shook violently. He looked up and saw Emperor Jing standing in front of him with a black face. He was shocked and said, Your Majesty, when did you come? Li Yi, do you know your crime? Emperor Jing looked at him and repeated what he had just said. We'll talk about this later. Li Yi showed a trace of excitement on his face and said, Your Majesty, I think I know how to cure Princess Yongning's illness. The corners of Changda's mouth twitched, and the expressions on the faces of several palace guards were quite interesting. In the whole palace, no, in the whole world, who dared to speak to His Majesty like this after being questioned in person? Who else but County Magistrate Li? Is this true? Emperor Jing's eyes flashed fiercely, and his breathing became slightly rapid. Concubine Liang had a weak temperament and was his favorite concubine. Her early death was still a pain in his heart until now. Yongning's character was almost the same as concubine Liang's, so he was naturally very fond of Yongning. However, after a serious illness, she suffered from the illness of losing her soul. She did not even recognize him, the Emperor Father, which made him feel helpless and disappointed. If Li Yi could really cure her, as long as he did not commit the crime of rebellion and treason. So what if he was pardoned? What's more, this time he did not. Is what you said true? After all, he was the emperor of a country. When Emperor Jing spoke again, his tone had returned to calmness. However, the excitement in the depths of his eyes could not be concealed. Yes. Li Yi took a deep breath and said, Is he serious? Li Xian stood at the door of a palace and said with some uncertainty, If he said it's possible, then it should be possible. Li Mingzu looked at the closed door and said hesitantly. Emperor Jing sat in a curtain, which had long been propped up with a canopy. His eyes were also staring in front. Inside the hall, the little girl stood there blankly. Her eyes were empty, as if she had lost her soul. She kept muttering, Beautiful sheep is gone, beautiful sheep is gone. He took a deep breath and forcibly suppressed the excitement in his heart. He squatted down and held her in his arms. He whispered, It doesn't matter if beautiful sheep is gone. We can make another one. What else does Yongning want? Pleasant sheep? Red wolf? Or little gray wolf? After saying this, Li Yi could clearly feel the little figure in his arms tremble. The soft murmurs disappeared. She looked up at Li Yi. Her wooden face finally showed some other expression. There was an inconceivable light in her big, gem-like eyes. Gradually, her eyes filled with tears, as if she had been greatly wronged. Her body trembled uncontrollably, and her little mouth pouted. She hugged Li Yi tightly with all the strength in her body. Wah! Suddenly, there was a cry in the hall. It was heartbreaking and heart-wrenching. Chapter 449. I miss Daddy. I miss Mommy. Lily will take her medicine. Little E is not afraid of injections. Little E must live well. Daddy, Mommy, where are you? Little E is so scared alone. Do you not want little E anymore? Little E, don't be afraid. Little E is not alone. Li Yi listened to the little girl's incessant murmuring. He used his hand to gently pat her back and said softly. Not long after, her murmuring gradually became softer. Looking at her clenched fists and furrowed brows in her sleep, Li Yi closed his eyes, and this scene began to appear in his mind. In the depths of the dark and serene palace, a 5-year-old girl curled up in a corner. She did not know what had happened, nor did she know what had happened to this world. Perhaps when she woke up, her daddy and mommy who loved her were gone, and the only one who accompanied her was a doll by her side. Although it wasn't good-looking and couldn't be compared to her beautiful sheep doll, it was her only playmate at the moment. It was also her only spiritual sustenance. She missed her beautiful sheep very much, so she gave it such a name. Then, someone finally appeared, but she did not know those people. They walked in from the outside, wearing strange clothes and saying strange things. They called her little princess. That was what her daddy used to call her, but where did daddy go? It was not only her daddy and mommy who disappeared. Pleasant sheep, big wolf, beautiful sheep, and lazy sheep. Where did they all go? She cried for her daddy and mommy. She wanted to leave this strange place. She wanted to go home, but the way those people looked at her slowly became strange. This made her very afraid. Every time she spoke, she would be looked at with a strange gaze. Then she stopped talking. Princess Yongning, who had been seriously ill and had miraculously woken up, became the topic that the people of Jingdo took delight in talking about. Regretfully, although the little princess had managed to keep her life, she had contracted an illness that caused her to lose her soul. The clever and quick-witted little princess had become stupid. The heavens were truly unfair to her. In the following year, a silly little girl appeared on the stone steps of a certain palace in the palace. She held a doll in her arms and only stared blankly into the distance. She was a target that all the princes and princesses could bully at will. Perhaps it was because she hid in the dark and silent palace at night that her tears had run dry. She never cried when she was bullied by other princes and princesses until the king of Shu destroyed her only hope. Li Yi tightened his arms and hugged her tightly. He couldn't imagine what kind of pain and torment a 5-year-old girl had suffered in this strange world for a year. He kissed her forehead with some pity. The little girl's fists gradually loosened and her brows relaxed. A smile appeared on Li Yi's face. He simply sat cross-legged on the ground and carefully let her lie in his arms. That's great, he thought to himself as he looked at the little girl in her sleep. At this moment, the feeling of loneliness that had never been extinguished in the depths of his heart completely disappeared. It's already midnight. Why is it taking so long? Li Xian's face was full of anxiety as he paced outside the palace. His tone was a little anxious. Li Yi said that he had a way to cure Princess Yongning's illness, but the condition was that they needed a quiet place. Only he and Princess Yongning were there. Even Imperial Physician Lu's request to go in and help was rejected. However, it had already been several hours since he entered the palace. Even the palace gates were closed, but there was no movement from inside. Li Xian couldn't help but feel worried. He was worried that Li Yi couldn't cure Yongning's illness and made Imperial Uncle wait outside for so long. This was a crime of deceiving the emperor, and it was much more serious than beating up the king of Shu. Why don't I go in and take a look? And Mingzu looked back at her father, who was still waiting there, and said with a frown. She had just taken 2 steps forward when a creaking sound suddenly rang out in the silent night. She looked in the direction of the sound and saw that the palace doors were slowly pushed open from the inside. 2 figures, one big and one small, walked out from inside. At this moment, Princess Royal Highness inexplicably had an illusion. The 2 figures who walked out holding hands seemed to be like this. Jing Di stood up from the chair, looked at the little girl, and slowly walked over. Yongning greets Imperial Father. Princess Yongning stood beside Li Yi, bowed to Jing Di, and said in a soft voice. Not far behind Jing Di, Imperial Physician Lu Jimin took a deep breath. Under the light, the little girl's intelligent eyes were as clear as water. Where was the slightest bit of foolishness? Li Xian was even more stunned on the spot. He actually did it. Was the little girl in front of him really the foolish Princess Yongning? A trace of joy flashed across Mingzhu's face, but Jing Di was even happier than her. The emperor's face finally showed a change of expression. How long had it been since he heard the word Imperial Father? Good. Jing Di said the word good 3 times in a row. He was obviously in a very good mood. Your Majesty, I only temporarily stabilized Princess Yongning's condition. If she wants to completely recover, she still needs a long time of treatment. Li looked at Jing Di and said, no matter how long it takes, as long as Yongning's illness can be cured. If there is anything you need, you could just tell me. Jing Di lovingly touched Yongning's little face, then looked up at Li Yi and asked, do you know what happened today? Ahem. Before Li Yi could speak, Imperial Physician Lu Jimin suddenly coughed in a low voice. Li Yi touched his forehead with one hand and tried hard to recall for a while. He said, Your Majesty, I only remember seeing the king of Shu bullying Princess Yongning in the palace. Later, when I came back to my senses, I saw Your Majesty in the Hall of Diligent Government. Imperial Physician Lu Jimin came forward and said respectfully, Your Majesty, please rest assured. I have already thought of a treatment for County Magistrate Li's illness. I only need to go back and read the medical books to verify it. I believe that County Magistrate Li will soon be cured. Jing Di glanced at Li Yi and said, The palace is closed today. You should stay in the palace and leave tomorrow morning. Yongning's body has just improved. Take her to rest early. Jing Di ordered. The eunuchs and palace maids who served Yongning immediately came forward. The little girl looked at Li Yi with reluctance. Thinking of what he had just warned her, she gritted her teeth and left, looking back 3 times. Jing Di did not mention the matter of the king of Shu until he left. It seemed that he had completely forgotten about it. When Li Yi and Li Xian were taken to a side hall by the eunuchs to rest, they remembered that they did not have a chance to send a message to their families today. Rui and the others should be very worried now. Chapter 450. At midnight, the gates of the capital were tightly shut. Other than some special places in the city that still had their lights on, the entire capital was plunged into darkness and silence. In the Viscount's mansion, all the maids and servants were already asleep. The guards in the mansion were also not on patrol. 2 burly men stood at the door of a small courtyard, their expressions unusually serious. In a room in the courtyard, it was slightly crowded. The news has already spread throughout the capital. It shouldn't be false. Since then, there has been no more news from the palace. I'm afraid that His Excellency has been kept in the palace. The palace is heavily guarded, and there are countless skilled fighters. It is impossible to force our way in. Right now, no one knows the situation in the palace. However, after tomorrow's morning court session, everything will be clear. As long as His Excellency leaves the palace, even if he is locked up in the Ministry of Justice's prison, it is not impossible for us to succeed. However, after rescuing His Excellency, we can no longer stay in the capital. We have to leave immediately. The water route is perfect. However, before that, We have to make some other arrangements. The thin, middle-aged man thought for a moment and spoke again. Everything depends on tomorrow. Right now, there's no need to be too anxious. Although the King of Shu's status is extraordinary, this matter also involves the crown prince of King Ning. Even the current emperor must consider King Ning. This matter will definitely be the focus of tomorrow's morning court session. What we need to do now is to wait. Wait my ass. We don't even know how His Excellency is doing in the palace. Fong slammed the table and said angrily. Lu Luo glanced at him and said, "This matter is of great importance. If we are not careful, we will be doomed eternally. Brother Fong, please calm down first. Otherwise, not only will we not be able to rescue His Excellency, but we will also lose our lives in vain." Fong clenched his fists tightly and breathed heavily. The veins on his forehead bulged, but in the end, he did not speak again. Other than the brothers Lu Luo and Lu Meng, everyone else in the room was from the original Willow Leaf Stockade that had moved to the capital with Lao Fong from Qing in Prefecture. Many of them were even more hot-tempered than Lao Fong. But the situation this time was unusual. Everyone was unusually quiet. Not long after, the door opened and everyone dispersed. Rui walked out of the courtyard and took 2 steps toward the courtyard next door. Suddenly, a voice came from the courtyard. "Ah, this old man has such a busy life. You all should go and rest. I'll take a nap and go there tomorrow morning to have a look." "Thank you, second uncle." Rui heaved a long sigh of relief. She closed the courtyard door and sat on a stone bench in the courtyard. Mississippi. Lu leaned against the stone table with her sword in her arms and said, "I'll wait at the palace gate tomorrow morning." Rui nodded. That was probably the place where she could get the news the fastest. Although she wanted to go there herself, if the situation changed, she needed to make more preparations. She had to think about their future from now on. Remember to stay calm when you're in trouble. Don't be reckless, she reminded. Mississippi Lu did not respond and walked back to her room. Xiao Huan stood at the door with panic and helplessness on her face. Rui walked over and hugged her gently. She whispered in her ear, "Don't worry. Everything will be fine. Now go to sleep." It was a silent night. No one knew what had happened in the mansion, but everyone felt strange. The maids and servants who had woken up early in the morning felt it the most. Second Miss went out before dawn. Madam and Miss Xiao Huan also left by car. Even the families outside the mansion did not open their doors. It seemed that there were a lot less people in the mansion, especially when the sun rose. The old man had not moved the strange chair out to bask in the sun, which made the servants in the mansion even more confused. They thought that Lord Zhu did not come back yesterday, and Madam went out early in the morning. So many people were not here. Did she bring people to catch? They thought of a possibility and immediately drove it out of their minds. This was the master's business. Not participating in the master's business was the first rule that servants in a big family should abide by. Today, the Viscount's mansion seemed to be more peaceful, but the court was in an uproar. The Qi Kingdom's redemption of the city and the crown prince gradually faded from the attention of the officials. Another matter was put on the desk. Emperor Jing glanced at the thick stack of memorials to impeach Li Yi, the county magistrate of Chang'an. He casually flipped through a few and lost interest. He said, "What do you think about this matter? Tell me." "Your Majesty, Li Yi, the Prince of Chang and County, beat the Prince of the Imperial Palace under the watchful eyes of the public. This kind of behavior is too bad. If we don't punish him severely, where will the dignity of the royal family and your Majesty be?" A middle-aged official stood up and said righteously. This person was the assistant minister of the Ministry of Rights. In addition to being in charge of education and diplomatic affairs, the Ministry of Rights was also responsible for maintaining everything related to the laws and regulations of the country. Of course, there was a more important reason why the assistant minister of the Ministry of Rights stood out. His surname was Chun, and Marquis Chen's mansion had always been close to the King of Shu. When such a thing happened, he would definitely stand on the side of the King of Shu. Assistant Minister Chun is right. The county magistrate of Chang and Li Yi offended his superior and seriously injured the king of Shu in front of the officials. He must be severely punished. Another official stood out and said, Assistant Minister Chun and Lord Wu are right. The county magistrate of Chong must be severely punished. I agree. As soon as he stood out, several more people agreed and seconded his opinion. The censors in the imperial court were very free today. The impeachment was actually their business, and the officials had always stood against them. However, today, all the officials were surprisingly unified. One after another, they rushed to express their opinions. They had no chance to speak at all. Of course, as the supervising censor, Li Xian was also one of the main characters in the fight. The censorate still cared about their reputation. If they didn't have to say anything today, they wouldn't say anything. If someone pointed out this matter, where would they hide their face? Today's matter was not like other debates about the crown prince or other matters, where the officials had different opinions and could not wait to fight. Today, everyone who stood out condemned the county magistrate of Chong and county magistrate Li Yi. The general meaning was that Li Yi was lawless and offended his superior. He had beaten up a prince in the palace in front of so many people. This was a vile act that had not happened in the past decades. The main culprit was Li Yi. If he did not kill him, the people would not be appeased. If he did not kill him, the people would not be appeased. In the process, they also emphasized the miserable state of the king of Shu. If the king of Shu had not been so seriously injured, they might have carried him here for everyone to see. They would definitely be able to gain enough allies. In contrast to these people, the old generals were all dozing off in the court. Assistant Minister of the Ministry of Personnel, Li Mingze, had a calm expression from beginning to end and did not say a word. At this moment, a young censor stood out. One of the officials of Prime Minister Qin, who was about to go up, stopped in his tracks. This censor, named Song Lang, had been appreciated by His Majesty a few days ago. His words would definitely carry more weight. Your Majesty, I impeach the supervisor of Jiangyi Province, Li Xian. As a censor, he did not fulfill his duty as a censor. He knowingly broke the law and beat up a prince together with the county magistrate of Chong. He should be punished with the same punishment. Your Majesty, please make a decision. After Song Lang finished speaking, he stood there quietly. The voices in the court suddenly became much quieter. Several officials of the censor felt their hearts skip a beat at the same time. They secretly cursed Song Lang in their hearts. How could this matter be mentioned in the court? Prince Ning only had one son. If he was really punished with the same punishment, it would not take long for the censor's office to be demolished. Wasn't Prime Minister Qin's position high enough? The officials of Prime Minister Qin's faction were usually arrogant enough in the court, right? But none of them mentioned the matter of Crown Prince Li Xian just now. It was not because they had forgotten, but because they did not dare to. Not only were the censors cursing Song Lang in their hearts, but the official who wanted to severely punish Li Yi also had a dark expression on his face. This rash young man was really touching the pot that shouldn't be boiled. Originally, everyone was well aware of this matter, but after he made such a fuss, it had to be put on the table. The assistant minister of the Ministry of Rights, who was the first to speak, braced himself again and said, It is obvious to all that Li Yi, the county magistrate of Chong, is the culprit of this matter. Crown Prince Li Xian may have been bewitched by him. Moreover, he did not cause much harm to His Highness, the King of Shu. The young censor Song Lang's words caused a sudden change in the court. From wanting to convict Li Yi, the county magistrate of Chong, and to wanting to exonerate Li Xian, the crown prince of Prince Ning, this made all the officials secretly despise him. A young official looked at the officials in the court who were intimidated by Ning Wang's power and were able to say such words that went against their will without blushing or panting. He sighed and was disappointed. So what if he was Ning Wang? Could he be more powerful than the emperor? More powerful than the laws of the country? Thinking of his 10 years of hard work and his lofty ideals of doing his best to serve the country, a trace of determination appeared on the young official's face. He strode forward and spoke his own voice. I second the motion. Looking at the performance of countless officials in the court, Emperor Jing finally waved his hand. A eunuch took out a booklet from his sleeve and walked down. He handed it to Prime Minister Shun and Prime Minister Qin, who were standing in front of the officials and had not spoken a word. Since ancient times, the left was the most respected. Therefore, between the left and right prime ministers, although Prime Minister Qin was the most powerful in the court, Prime Minister Shun's status was higher. Prime Minister Shun took the booklet and opened it with a puzzled look. After a while, his expression became a little strange, and he handed the booklet to Prime Minister Qin. Seeing the expression on Prime Minister Shun's face, Prime Minister Qin could not help but have a bad premonition. He took the booklet and looked at it. After a while, when the booklet was handed out from Prime Minister Qin's hand, his expression also began to become a little ugly. As this booklet was circulated among the officials, the sound of exclamations and gasps could be heard in the hall. The officials all had different expressions. Gradually, the court became strangely quiet. Many officials looked at Prime Minister Qin and the officials who were close to the King of Shu. Although they did not say it explicitly, the meaning was self-evident. As an adult prince, he actually took the initiative to bully a young and stupid princess. When His Majesty was seriously ill, not only did he not stay in the palace to fulfill his filial duties, but he also held a banquet in his mansion. Thinking of the King of Shu's previous actions, Prime Minister Qin, tell me, what kind of person do you want to help ascend the throne? If someone with such a temperament became the emperor, many officials felt that their lives would be greatly threatened. This was only one point in the booklet. In addition, what about the intermittent hysteria of the Prince of Chang and County? This booklet was sent from His Majesty, so there was no doubt about its authenticity. With the testimony of the Imperial Physician Bureau, the illness of the Prince of Chang and County should not be fake. The Prince of Chang and County was actually suffering from hysteria. No one had ever known about this before. But in this way, the mystery in everyone's hearts was finally explained. No wonder he would do such a thing. Except for a lunatic, how could a normal person beat a prince in the palace in front of the civil and military officials? Heir Li Xian had always been close to him. Could it be that he was infected by Li Xian? However, beating a prince was beating a prince. Hysteria was not a reason to beat a prince. Although the punishment could be reduced according to the circumstances, the King of Shu had been injured to such a degree. If it was lightly mentioned, how could the royal family save face? But how could the silly Princess Yong Ning suddenly be cured by him? Everyone in the court knew about Princess Yong Ning's illness. A year ago, in order to cure Princess Yong Ning's soullessness, His Majesty ordered a search for famous doctors all over the world. He even promised a generous reward. The reward was so generous that anyone would be tempted. But unfortunately, even the Imperial Physician Bureau thought that the princess's illness was incurable. Countless famous doctors could not do anything about it. After a long time, the matter was left unsettled. But things in the world were so unexpected. The King of Shu was beaten, and Princess Yong Ning's terminal illness was cured. All of this was done by one person. Was it a reward or a punishment? Was it praise or scolding? The water had been muddled by the air of Prince Ning. Now it undoubtedly became complicated. In the court, no one dared to interrupt. The strange silence lasted for a long time. Emperor Jing waved his hand. An official took out the prepared imperial edict and began to read it. Li yawned. When he opened his eyes, he saw a familiar old face. It was a very comfortable sleep. Li Yi sat up and tried to distance himself from Chang's old face. He said, "It's so early in the morning. Is there anything I can help you with, Chief Steward Chang?" "County Magistrate Li, it's time for you to leave the palace." Changda was expressionless and said lightly. A palace maid had already brought the toiletries. After washing up, Li Yi stepped out of the hall. There was a warm breeze outside, and the sun was shining brightly. "How did you cure Princess Yongning?" Li Yi turned around and saw Chang just standing in the hall looking at him. "Before I answer this question, can I ask Chief Steward Chang a question?" Li Yi crossed his arms and looked at him. "Speak," Changda said lightly. "Do you know the Sunflower Manual?" Li looked at him and asked with great interest. When Li walked briskly out of the palace, Changda, who was standing at the entrance of a palace and muttering the words Sunflower Manual, seemed to feel something. He suddenly turned his head and looked in a certain direction. He looked at the empty hall. The confusion on his face lasted for a moment before he slowly withdrew his gaze. At the same time, the manager of the catering department looked at the rows of servants with a gloomy expression. He said angrily, "Speak. Who stole the white-cut chicken that His Highness Prince Jean asked for?" The people of a certain street in the capital were surprised to find that a smoothie shop that had been very popular recently was not open. They paced around the entrance for a moment before leaving with some regret. In the backyard of the shop, the woman in white had a calm expression. A few sturdy figures sat there and looked in the direction of the palace. The atmosphere was extremely tense. Chapter 451. The stone steps leading to the outside of the palace were very long. The guards at the palace gate were still expressionless. Their sharp eyes scanned the surroundings to prevent unrelated people from approaching. He walked out of the palace gate and looked back. At this moment, everything seemed to be normal, but also seemed to be different. It was not noon yet, but the sun was shining brightly and the temperature was just right. The woman standing under the willow tree with a sword in her arms was even more beautiful. Life was so beautiful, and Lee was in an extremely good mood. He strode over, opened his arms, and gave Mississippi Lou a big hug. Because he was too happy, he picked her up and spun her around. At the critical moment, he remembered that this was Mississippi Lou, not Xiao Huan or Yong Ning, so he did not dare to kiss her pretty face or forehead. Before she could react, Li Yi quickly put her down and then waved his hand. "Go home." Looking at his back, Mississippi Lou gradually put down her arms that were holding the sword, as if she had put down something extremely heavy at the same time. A few hundred meters away from the palace gate, a man who was sitting under a big tree and chatting with a tea vendor turned his head to look, and a trace of joy appeared on his face. He stood up and quickly disappeared into the alley. Not long after, the people on a certain street were surprised to find that the smoothie shop that was tightly closed in the morning had actually opened for business. They hurriedly rushed to the door of the shop. A few days ago, the shop had released a few new products. Because there were too many people queuing every day, they had not tried it for several days. They could not miss it today. Today's morning court session did not last long. The officials walked out of the palace gate in twos and threes, with complicated expressions and different thoughts. Everyone was thinking about the content of the imperial edict from His Majesty just now. The Crown Prince of Chang and County Li Yi and the Crown Prince of Prince Ning, Li Xian, had beaten the prince in the imperial palace in front of all the civil and military officials of the imperial court. Their behavior was extremely abominable. Of course, they couldn't let it go lightly. As a result, Crown Prince Li Xian was stripped of his position as the supervising commissioner of Jiangyi province. He had to spend half a month in the Crown Prince's mansion to reflect on his mistakes and was not allowed to step out of the mansion. Although Li Yi, the county magistrate of Chang, had a sudden attack of hysteria, it was not the reason for him to seriously injure the king of Shu. However, since he miraculously cured Princess Yongning's terminal illness, His Majesty was very pleased. In the spirit of humanitarianism, His Majesty did not punish him severely. He was only stripped of his position as the Assistant Minister of the Ministry of War and fined his salary for a year. It was not until the officials walked out of the hall that they realized when Li Yi, the county magistrate of Chang, became the Assistant Minister of the Ministry of War. Although His Majesty had mentioned this matter in the court, it was immediately opposed by many officials. In the end, it was left unsettled. How could such a thing happen when there was no sign of anything happening? However, although this move seemed unreasonable, no one, including Prime Minister Qin, objected to it. Since they knew the whole story of yesterday's incident, they immediately understood that the king of Shu's beating was probably in vain. Now that things had developed to this point, it was no longer as simple as it was in the beginning. On the contrary, it had little to do with Crown Prince Li Xian and Crown Prince Li. His Majesty had always been strict with the princes, especially in terms of morality. As an adult prince, the king of Shu actually bullied a 6-year-old little princess. Although Princess Yongning was not the biological daughter of concubine Shui, she was his younger sister anyway. After knowing this matter, even they were extremely disappointed in the king of Shu, let alone his majesty. If the king of Shu did not have the support of several rich and powerful families and the support of Prime Minister Qin in the court, he would not have had a chance to be the crown prince. As for the inheritance of the heir over the concubines, what was the ancestral system compared to the rise and fall of the country? This time, His Majesty had undoubtedly conveyed his attitude to the officials. After today, the officials who were firmly on the king of Shu's side would try their best to change the situation, while those who were still wavering on the sidelines would probably feel even more uneasy. But in any case, no one would mention making the king of Shu the crown prince in a short period of time. In a secluded hall in the palace, the king of Shu was lying on his back on the bed. His head was covered with white gauze, and his eyes were fixed on the ceiling. You disappoint me so much." Concubine Shui stood in front of the bed, her face full of anger. She looked at the king of Shu and said, "Why did you provoke Yongning? Do you know how difficult it was for us to get to where we are today in order for you to become the crown prince and ascend the throne in the future?" The king of Shu's face was covered with white gauze, so his expression could not be seen at all. Only from his clenched fists and the deep hatred in his eyes could one tell his mood at the moment. He had just learned of what had happened in the court today. He wanted to cut Li Yi into pieces and eat his blood and flesh, but he was only fined a year's salary. To him, what could be more ironic than this? As a prince, he was beaten and seriously injured in front of everyone, and now he could only lie on the bed, unable to move. But the person who beat him up was not punished at all. How could he still have the face to stand in front of others in the future? He hated Li Yi, he hated Li Xian, and he also hated the person he should not hate. If he had given him the title of crown prince earlier, "You should recuperate here these days. I have already written to your uncle. They will help you think of a way. After you recover, you can go to Prime Minister Qin's residence." Lying on the bed, the king of Shu listened to concubine Shui's words. He loosened his clenched fists and took a deep breath. "I know." He gritted his teeth and squeezed these words out of his mouth. For many people, the king of Shu's loss of power was not something to be happy about. According to the officials in the Shangshu province, Prime Minister Qin had been sullen today. It was rare for him to reprimand an official for a small matter. All the officials in the Shangshu province felt insecure. In Duke Qin's residence, a servant girl lowered her head to clean up the broken teacup. She did not even dare to breathe loudly, let alone look up. Recalling the conversation between the two masters just now, the servant girl outside the door quietly left and trotted toward the small courtyard. The officials and nobles who were close to the king of Shu were naturally not in a good mood. However, there were also people who praised Li Xianzi in their hearts. After the few princes who were still in the capital who were about to come of age heard about what happened today, their minds finally became active. They originally thought that with their strength, it was impossible for them to compete with the king of Shu. However, what happened today had ignited a glimmer of hope in their hearts. Even if it was only a glimmer, no one was willing to give up. At the same time, there were also countless letters flying out of the capital. Their destination was the fiefdom of those princes who had come of age. In the crown prince's residence, Li Xian was having a headache dealing with the Wang family. In the viscount's residence, Li Yi was also humbly receiving lessons from the old mistress. The servant girls all felt that it was unfair for Lord Zhu. Although they did not know what Lord Zhu had done to make the old mistress so angry, their monthly allowance had been doubled by Lord Zhu. Naturally, they would side with Lord Zhu. The servant girls in the residence counted with their fingers how much double the monthly allowance was. They could get a lot more every month. If this continued, they would be able to renovate their house in no time. She did not dare to think about it anymore. The chicken that the old mistress wanted had not been cooked yet. She did not understand why the old mistress specifically told the chicken not to be chopped in vain. Obviously, chopping in vain was her best method. Chapter 452. Child, why did you provoke the King of Shu? The King of Shu belongs to the Li family. Do you think a mere viscount like you can provoke him? Madame Dowager sat on the chair and reprimanded him with a sullen face. You are now a dignitary in the capital city. You can't be impulsive. The lives of dozens of people in the Viscount's mansion are in your hands. Do you know how dangerous it is in the court today? If it weren't for His Majesty's wise judgment, who didn't favor the King of Shu and only removed you from your official position and grounded you at home for half a month, how could you be standing here now? Madame Dowager had always been kind, especially in front of Li. She didn't even bear to say a harsh word to him. But today, she seemed to be really angry. After hearing that Li had returned to the mansion, she rushed over from the Li family as soon as possible. She had been reprimanding him for almost an hour. At first, Li could admit his mistake humbly and promise that he would never do it again. But later, he really didn't know what to say and could only listen with his head lowered. Of course, Madame Dowager was also very protective of him. After all, the King of Shu was a prince of a country. He represented the face of the royal family and had a very strong influence in the court. Normal people wouldn't provoke him. Moreover, what he had done could no longer be described as provoking. To be honest, it wasn't that he had nothing better to do. He just wanted to play with the King of Shu after eating and drinking. In the situation at that time, when he heard Princess Yoning's words, he felt as if his brain was about to explode. Blood rushed to his head. Not to mention the King of Shu. Even if he was the crown prince, the emperor, or the heavenly king, he would probably dare to go up and beat him first. As for the result, at that time, how could he have the time to think about it? Madame Dowager, have a cup of tea. As Old Foreign reprimanded Lord Ju, the maids in the residence retreated. Rui walked in with a cup of tea and handed it to Old Foreign personally. The status of the King of Shu is so. Seeing Rui, Madame Dowager immediately smiled and changed the topic. Let's not talk about the King of Shu for the time being. Let's talk about you two. You've been married for so long, but Rui's belly hasn't moved at all. Your second uncle's child got married later than you did. Now Miss Zhou's belly is bulging. Do you want to find some imperial physicians to take a good look at you? Just a moment ago, he was being reprimanded, and the next second, he was talking about children. The old man's change of topic was too sudden, and Li couldn't keep up. Rui was taken aback for a moment and blushed. She handed the tea to Old Madam and hurriedly left. Old Foreign put down the teacup and looked at Li. This concerns the continuation of the family line. You must pay more attention to this matter. I'll go talk to Rui again. Seeing Old Foreign leave the room, Li sat on the chair. His legs were numb from standing for so long. He picked up the teacup and took a sip. His right index finger tapped unconsciously on the table. The King of Shu. The maids who were about to come in to clean the room saw Lord Ju's expression and thought that he was upset because Old Foreign had just reprimanded him. So she carefully left. Not long after, Rui walked in from outside. Seeing Li's thoughtful expression, she didn't say anything. She just walked behind him, reached out her hand, and gently massaged his shoulder. Li returned to his senses and stood up. Seeing the worry on her brows, he held her hand and said, "The matter of children cannot be rushed. Wife, you don't have to care about Old Foreign's words." Rui shook her head and said, "It's not because of this matter." Li sighed and said, "This time, I was indeed a little impulsive." Rui raised her head to look at him. Hubby is not an impulsive person. This concubine believes that hubby must have his reasons for doing so. This concubine only hopes that I can share some of the burden with hubby. Hubby knows that this concubine is also very powerful. Li fell silent. To him, in this world, there was nothing more important than the people in that small courtyard in the willow leaf stockade. He didn't want to bring in those irrelevant things from the outside world. They shouldn't have come into contact with these things. However, he seemed to have neglected the feelings of Rui and the others. Rui was obviously unhappy. Thinking of Mississippi Lou's hidden worry and Xiao Huan's red and swollen eyes, he patted Rui's hand and said, "I'm sorry. It's my fault. I made you worry. Wife, don't you want to know what I'm going to do? I'll tell you now." Li looked at her and asked, "About the King of Shu." Wife, how much do you know? Rui nodded and said, I heard everything Old Foreign said just now. The king of Shu is the eldest son of his majesty and the prince most likely to inherit the throne. His mother is concubine Shui, and he has the support of several rich families led by the Chui family. He also has the support of Prime Minister Qin and countless officials in the court. Li Yi nodded and said seriously, Yes, the king of Shu is the most likely to sit on the throne among all the princes. What we need to do is to guard the Viscount mansion and live a good life. By the way, we can pull him down from that position. Ru Yi raised her head abruptly and looked at Li Yi. Even she was shocked by what he said just now. Looking at her surprised expression, Li Yi couldn't help but laugh. He stretched out his index finger and tapped on her forehead, saying, I'm just joking, wife. Don't take it seriously. Even His Majesty didn't punish me much, wife, so you don't have to worry. Li Yi comforted her as he moved the rocking chair out to bask in the sun. After a while, looking at the figure leisurely lying in the courtyard and teasing the little maid, Rui's eyes flashed with a trace of determination. She lowered her voice and said something. I know, Liham Monarch Jean did not have a good time these days. Even though his teacher was grounded by his imperial father and could not come to the palace, and he had not seen him for a few days, every time he thought of how crazy he looked that day, even if it was in his dreams, Monarch Jean would be startled. Especially after he went to visit the king of Shu and thought that the reason why his teacher went crazy was because the king of Shu bullied Yongning. He had more nightmares at night. He saw it very clearly that day. The king of Shu didn't even touch Yongning, but she ended up in such a miserable state. Thinking about how he pulled Yongning's face, snatched her bestowment of ice, and said that she was a motherless child, the king of Shu's miserable state appeared in front of his eyes again. Monarch Jean shivered and quickened his steps to the hall of diligent government. He heard that Yongning was no longer stupid. She must still remember that he bullied her. He wanted to see his imperial father. He could not go to mathematics class anymore. He could not see his teacher anymore. Otherwise, when his teacher found out about those things, he would definitely be beaten to death. Chapter 453. In the Hall of Diligent Government. In addition to Emperor Jing, who was sitting in the seat of honor, there were many people in the hall. A man who looked to be in his 40s, dressed in a scarlet official uniform, frowned and asked, Sir Yin, why is the military expenditure this year so much higher than in previous years? Did the Ministry of War really calculate it correctly? What does Lord Qin mean by this? On the other side, a man with a square face and a dignified expression said faintly, Every time the military expenditure is calculated, I will specially invite a few mathematicians from the Imperial College to help me calculate it. Why? Lord Qin, are you suspecting that the Imperial College has calculated wrongly? Or are you suspecting that the Ministry of War has reported the military expenditure falsely? Although the person in front of him was the current Minister of Revenue, Qin Shao, the two of them had similar official positions, so the middle-aged man didn't have to give him any face. Qin Huan had just asked a question when he was interrupted by the Minister of War, Yin Bing. Naturally, he felt depressed. The Imperial College had the most talented mathematicians of the Jing Kingdom. The military expenditure was huge, and it was no small matter. It was impossible for them to make a mistake in their calculations. Qin Huan himself would not doubt it, and even if he did doubt it, he would not say it here. The Chancellor of the Directorate, the Minister of Education, and several scholars from the Hongwen School were all standing at the side. There were even a few Confucian scholars among them. These Confucian scholars didn't care if he was the Minister of Revenue or not. If he dared to doubt their professionalism here, they would definitely fight him to the death. As for suspecting the Ministry of War of falsely reporting military expenditures, there was no evidence. Even His Majesty couldn't say such a thing. Qin Huan wasn't that stupid. He explained, You've misunderstood, Sir Yin. It's just that I'm sure Sir Yin is aware of the current state of the National Treasury. As the Minister of Revenue, it's my duty to investigate every sum of money. I hope Sir Yin won't take it to heart. Yin Bing glanced at him and said, In the past few years, the dynasty was stable and there were no wars, so the military expenditure was naturally low. Although the results of this campaign are impressive, the expenditure is not small. Whether it's rations, military equipment, or the soldiers' salaries, they all require money. Lord Qin, don't think too simply. Qin Huan pondered for a moment before he nodded and finally stopped talking. Although the national treasury was tight, the money had to be squeezed out no matter what. It was just that the days ahead would be even more difficult. The matter of military expenditure is of great importance. We will discuss it later. My two beloved ministers, please wait for a moment. Emperor Jing walked down from above and spoke to the two of them. Then, he looked at the people waiting at the side and asked, "May I know why the great scholars entered the palace?" Among the people from the Directorate of Directorates and Hong Wenguan, 3 of them were old men with white hair and beards. Although their positions were not high, they had spent their entire lives teaching and had many achievements. Even Emperor Jing had to give them enough respect. An old man stepped forward and bowed to Emperor Jing, saying, "Your Majesty, I heard that the county magistrate of Chang and Li Yi taught the princes and princesses arithmetic at the age of 20. Is this true?" "It's true." Emperor Jing's eyes flashed with a strange light, and he nodded. "Please forgive me for speaking bluntly." The old man stroked his beard and said, "This is too ridiculous. That Li Yi is only indebted to His Majesty and was bestowed the title of County Magistrate of Chang. He is only 20 years old, and yet he only has the title of elementary scholar. This shows how shallow his knowledge is. How can such a person become the teacher of the prince and princess? What virtue or ability did that Li Yi have? What does His Majesty think of the Directorate of Directorates and Hong Wenguan?" The old man's words were so direct that Emperor Jing could not answer for a while. Qin Huan, the Minister of Revenue, looked at the people from the Directorate of Directorates and Hong Wenguan with a strange look on his face. Those people had finally taken action against the County Magistrate of Chang and Li Yi. The incident of the County Magistrate of Chang and beating the king of Shu had passed. Because this matter involved many people, once it became a big deal, the reputation of the king of Shu would be ruined. Therefore, the officials of the king of Shu, including Prime Minister Qin, all chose to remain silent and did not make things difficult for the county magistrate of Chang and Li. However, it was also impossible for this matter to be brushed aside so easily. If they were only slightly interested in the county magistrate of Chang, and a few days ago, after that day, Li Yi had officially become a thorn in their side. He had only done one thing and made countless people's long-term hard work go down the drain. If the county magistrate of Chang then was not eliminated, it would be difficult to vent their anger. The words of the great scholar from the Directorate of Directorates were the first step of their revolt. After all, these two places were the sphere of influence of the officials of Prime Minister Qin. Qin Huang glanced at Yin Bing, the Minister of War opposite him. Seeing his expressionless face, Qin Huan wondered why Yin Bing did not say a word at this moment, given his relationship with the Li family. Your Highness, His Majesty is discussing important matters with several officials." "Your Highness can't go in." Suddenly, there was a noise at the door of the hall, temporarily breaking the atmosphere in the hall. Everyone looked in the direction of the door. "Father!" Li Han, the Prince of Jin, dodged 2 eunuchs and ran in, panting. When he just said this, he could not help but be stunned when he saw so many people in the hall. Except for his father, he did not know most of the people in the hall, but the 2 old men standing there were teachers who taught him Confucian classics and history. When Li Han saw them, he felt a headache and said in a low voice, "Father, please go ahead. It will wait for you outside." Emperor Jing was usually busy with state affairs and had little time to teach his children. He remembered that the last time he saw Li Han, Prince of Jin, his face was rounder than it was now. He did not expect that he had lost so much weight in such a short time. He could not help but feel distressed and guilty. He touched his head and said, "It's okay. Han, we'll go over there and play alone for a while. When father is done with his business, I will accompany you." Li Han nodded and walked to the upper table alone. Emperor Jing looked a little absent-minded. In his memory, Prince of Jin had always been naughty and mischievous. He did not have the heart to study and liked to play. When he saw him again today, he had grown so much and become so well-behaved and sensible. As a father, he did not even know when his child had grown up. As an emperor, he was undoubtedly qualified. But as a father, Emperor Jing sighed in his heart, and his expression could not help but become gloomy. The appearance of Prince of Jin was only a small interlude. Seeing him walk to the back, a secretary of the Imperial College stood up and said, "Your Majesty, that Li Yi abandoned the calculation method and introduced that a bon number. This is an act of forgetting his roots. How can such a person who forgets his ancestors become the teacher of the princes? The education of the princes is the most important thing. Your Majesty must not be careless. Could it be that the Imperial College's Doctor of Mathematics is inferior to a mere scholar? The county magistrate of Chang and city, Li Yi, is immoral and incompetent. How can he teach our princes? Your Majesty, please reconsider and do not let the princes down. If this matter is spread, I am afraid that the people will laugh at us and think that there is no one in the Imperial College." The people of the Imperial College and the Hongwen School did not feel the change in Emperor Jing's mood. They all stepped forward and spoke sharply. There was only one request. The county magistrate of Chang and city, Li Yi, had no talent and was not qualified to be the teacher of the princes and princesses. In order to prevent the princes from being delayed, they should choose a doctor of mathematics from the Imperial College to teach them personally. As for the county magistrate of Chang and city, Li Yi, he should go back to where he came from. The people of the Imperial College and the Hongwen School tried to persuade Emperor Jing. On the table, Prince Jin, Li Han, was not interested in the conversation. He sat on a chair that did not match his body and looked around for a while. He felt a little bored and glanced at an open memorial on the table. He casually glanced at it and saw something familiar. He moved closer with interest. Chapter 454. Qin Huan listened to the advice of the directorate and the Hongwen School. He waited quietly on the side without much change in his expression. Although his surname was Qin, he had nothing to do with Prime Minister Qin. Because of his sensitive identity, he had never agreed to be recruited by any prince. Moreover, deep down, he did not approve of the king of Shu becoming the next emperor. If he was merely of mediocre aptitude, it would have been fine. It would have been difficult for the kingdom of Jing, which had been stabilized by several generations of emperors, to be completely defeated in his hands. However, the things that the king of Shu had done in recent days had caused him to become somewhat vigilant. Not to mention that the king of Jing Kingdom was incompetent. If he did not have the most basic moral integrity and was surrounded by foreign enemies, there was a possibility that the king of Jing Kingdom would perish. As for Li Yi, the prince of Chang, and county that everyone was talking about, Qin Huan never doubted his majesty's ability to judge people. Since his majesty asked him to teach the princes and princesses arithmetic, it meant that Li Xianzi was indeed qualified to do so. Anyway, this matter had nothing to do with him, so he stopped paying attention to it. Qin Huan glanced around the hall casually. When he was about to withdraw his gaze, he was suddenly startled and looked in a certain direction. Monarch Jin's fat figure was lying on the table. He bit the tip of his pen and frowned, as if he was thinking about something. After a while, his eyebrows relaxed, and he looked a little proud. He picked up the pen and wrote quickly on the paper. After a while, he frowned again. Seeing this, Qin Huan suddenly felt a little confused. Seeing that the directorate belittled Li Yi's new arithmetic, Emperor Jing frowned and asked, "Isn't it said that the new arithmetic created by Li Yi is convenient and easy to use? I asked the directorate to try it out for a year. If it works, it will be promoted to the whole country. With such merit, why can't Li Yi be the teacher of the princes?" An old man snorted and said, "I've seen Li Yi's new method of calculation. It's nothing but a crooked method. How can it compare to the method passed down by our ancestors? The method of calculation is so convenient, yet he actually wants to replace it. If I were to meet such a person who has forgotten his ancestors, I'll definitely smash his head open." Qin Huan withdrew his gaze from Prince Jin and looked at the old man. The corners of his mouth couldn't help but twitch. Li Xianzi even dared to beat the king of Shu, so why would he be afraid of an old scholar? He was afraid that his old bones would be torn apart before he could break Li Xianzi's head. As soon as the old scholar finished speaking, the Chancellor of the Directorate of Imperial Academy stepped forward and said, "Your Majesty, although some people in the Directorate of Imperial Academy think that Li Yi's new mathematics is remarkable, they can't replace our plan. If we carry it out rashly, I'm afraid that it will only lead the students astray. If the foundation of the scholars in the Jing Kingdom is damaged, even if I die 10,000 times, I won't be able to absolve myself of the blame." In front of Emperor Jing, the Chancellor of the Directorate had already spoken very tactfully. The general meaning was that Li Yi's new mathematics was nothing. The Directorate of Imperial Academy didn't care about it all. "Your Majesty, you are a layman, so don't blindly compare. When it comes to this, the Directorate of Imperial Academy is the professional." After that, several people stepped forward to speak. The general meaning was similar to that of the Chancellor of the Directorate of Imperial Academy. They belittled Li Yi's new mathematics. If such a person was allowed to teach the princes and princesses, not only would the Directorate of Imperial Academy and Hongwen School lose face, but His Majesty would also lose face outside the palace. Emperor Jing frowned, and a trace of doubt finally appeared on his face. Although he had dabbled in mathematics, he was not arrogant enough to think that he was better than the Directorate of Imperial Academy. Everyone, including the two great scholars, belittled Li Yi's new mathematics. Was he really wrong? Thinking of the way Li Yi used to teach the princes and princesses, Emperor Jing became even more doubtful. Seeing the doubt on Emperor Jing's face, the officials of the Directorate of Imperial Academy and the scholars of Hongwen School finally breathed a sigh of relief. The teachers of the princes were respected and extraordinary. This was an invisible umbrella in itself. Without this identity, the Prince of Chong and County was just the Prince of Chong and County. It would be much more convenient for them to deal with it. Qin Huan looked at Yin Bing again and found that he still had a dead face. His Majesty was obviously about to be convinced by them. Was Yin Bing really not going to do anything? Forget it. Anyway, this matter has nothing to do with me. Qin Huan shook his head and inadvertently glanced at Prince Jean behind him. He found that Prince Jean had put down his brush and stretched himself. The expression on his face seemed to be a little satisfied. In that case, thinking that Li Yi himself seemed not very satisfied with this task, Emperor Jing thought for a while and said, "Let's choose from the Directorate of Imperial Academy. Father." Suddenly, a child's voice came from behind. Emperor Jing turned his head and saw Prince Jean, Li Han, standing behind him with something in his hand. Taking a closer look, he found that it was a memorial that had just been submitted by the Ministry of War. It recorded the details of various military expenses. It was also the thing that the two ministers had just argued about. He took the memorial from Li Han's hand and said, "You can't touch this. Han, wait a little longer. Father will play with you when it's over." "Father," they made a mistake in one of the questions. Prince Jean raised his head and looked at Emperor Jing. The 9-year-old fat boy was actually quite handsome. When he raised his head and spoke, he had a kind of cute feeling. At this time, his face was a little proud, like a child who had done a good deed and was waiting for an adult to praise him. This was the truth. Emperor Jing was stunned for a moment. Then he smiled and shook his head, saying, "Hana, don't make trouble. Go over there to play." Even though Li Yi had once told him that Prince Jean was very talented in mathematics, Emperor Jing did not think that he would be better than the mathematics masters of the Directorate of Imperial Academy. If there was a problem with this memorial, who knew how many heads the Ministry of War would lose? How could Bing take this matter lightly? "Father, they really made a mistake." His father did not believe him. Li Han felt a little wronged and said anxiously. Emperor Jing frowned and was about to reprimand him. However, when he saw Prince Jin's aggrieved face and his tears were about to come out, he remembered that he did not know how long it had been since he had a good talk with him. His heart softened and he said, "Well, then Han, tell father, where did they make a mistake?" The fat boy smiled again and opened the memorial in Emperor Jing's hand. Seeing the dense and strange characters on the memorial, Minister of War Yin Bing's face changed greatly. He looked at Emperor Jing and said, "Your Majesty, this..." Emperor Jing waved his hand and said, "Just draw up a new one after you leave." Yin Bing watched Prince Jin open the long memorial and spread it on the ground. The original blank space had long been filled with characters. He could only nod with a bitter smile. "Here, it's here." The fat boy pointed to a place and said confidently, "Father, look." The transportation of grain and fodder between Liangzhou and Yuzhou should not be distributed like this. In this way, there will be too much consumption on the road. Prince Jin half knelt on the ground and pointed to a formula next to him. He said, "If there's a little more here and a little less here, it will be the best distribution. At least, the consumption will be reduced by more than 10%. It will also be a lot of money." The people of the Imperial College did not take this matter to heart. Yin Bing and Emperor Jing did not think that a 9-year-old child could point out the mistakes in the Imperial Court's military expenditure, so they did not pay much attention. Although Prince Jin's words were vague, Qin Huan, who had always been sensitive to money, quickly understood. The Ministry of Revenue had always aimed to do the most things with the least amount of money. No matter where the application was, they wanted to reduce the amount by 20%. The amount of military expenditure was huge, and the Ministry of Revenue allocated the majority of it every year. He had always been very cautious. However, because the Ministry of War had its own calculation method and he had the help of the Imperial College's mathematical masters, Qin Huan almost never doubted their correctness. What was the result? The problem could be solved with 100,000 taels, but the Ministry of War asked for 120,000 taels from the Ministry of Revenue. Of course, this money was not embezzled by the Ministry of War. It was wasted on the road, and this was only the first time. 20,000 taels for one time. How much would it be for 10 times? If the mathematical masters of the Imperial College were at this level, how much money would the National Treasury have wasted over the years? Qin Huan's heart was immediately filled with anger when he thought about the emperor's reduction of taxes, the emptiness of the national treasury, and how he worried about money every day. He had trouble eating and sleeping. The Ministry of War and the Imperial College were dragging the Ministry of Revenue down. Of course, he would not be so impulsive. Prince Jin was only a child who was less than 10 years old. What if he made a mistake? So, Qin Huan squatted down and began to check his calculation. Not long after, Qin Huan's breathing gradually became heavy. He looked up at the Minister of War, Yin Bing, and the people of the Imperial College. His eyes were bloodshot, like a fierce beast choosing its prey. Chapter 455. Okay, I got it. Hunt, go over there and play for a while. I'll be back soon. Emperor Jing helped Prince Jin up from the ground and patted the dirt off him. Although Prince Jin had become unusually well-behaved and sensible these days, he was still a child who was less than 10 years old. Emperor Jing still did not think that he could participate in these military and national affairs. Father, Li Han was not stupid. Seeing that his father did not care about the result that he had spent a lot of effort to calculate, he was immediately disappointed and anxious. How could he have made a mistake? There was a similar problem in the booklet. The 3 black-hearted shopkeepers had tortured him for several days. It was not easy for him to figure it out. How could he have made a mistake in such a simple problem? Your Highness, this is not a place for you to mess around. Leave quickly. How could they be disturbed by a naughty child when the monarch and his ministers were discussing matters? The great scholar who taught the prince's Confucian classics said with a frown. He then looked at Emperor Jing and said, Your Majesty, the art of arithmetic has been around for thousands of years. A young boy can propose the so-called new arithmetic. It is really shut up. Before the old man finished speaking, there was a sudden shout in the hall. Everyone, including Emperor Jing, was startled. Qin Huan, the Minister of Revenue, had a bloodshot face. He stood up and looked at the old man and asked, His Majesty asked you to try and promote the new arithmetic in the Imperial College, but you rejected it? The old man was also frightened by Qin Huan's appearance. After he came to his senses, He looked at him angrily and said, "Yes, you dare to call yourself new with a crooked method." The Ministry of Revenue was in charge of the country's finances. Its position was both important and awkward. For the sake of money, it often entangled with various ministries. The officials of the Ministry of Revenue hoped that the national treasury would be full and that money would never run out. At this time, Qin Huan did not care that this was the hall of diligent government. His Majesty was beside him. All he could think about was the money that had been lost. He felt that his heart was bleeding. He rushed up and grabbed the old man's collar. He said word by word, "Say it again." At this moment, he didn't care about any great scholars at all. He wanted nothing more than to tear those fellows from the Directorate of Imperial Academies into pieces. "Lord Qin, what are you doing? Are you crazy? Let go of old Wu." Come, come, Lord Qin is crazy." Qin Huan, the Minister of Revenue, who had suddenly gone mad, shocked everyone again. They were afraid that he would beat Elder Wu up like Li Xianzi. What was going on in the Imperial Palace? Could it be that something evil had happened? In just a few days, a county magistrate and a minister had gone crazy one after another. It seemed that they needed to invite a few Taoist masters to exorcise the evil. The people from the directorate hurried forward to pull the two apart, but Qin Huan refused to let go. His furious gaze sent chills down their spines. Emperor Jing recovered from the shock and quickly said, "Minister Qin, what happened? Let go of old Wu first and tell me slowly." Qin Huan's breathing was heavy. After taking a few deep breaths, he slowly loosened his grip. When he turned his head, his eyes were wet as he hissed, "Your Majesty, the Directorate of Directorates has harmed the country." The old man he had grabbed by the collar was tidying up his clothes. But when he heard these words, a look of rage appeared on his face as he loudly shouted, "Impudent! Official Qin, you are the Minister of Revenue, yet you dare to speak such words to insult my directorate. This old man will definitely report you in court in front of all the officials. Report your mother." At this moment, Qin Huan finally understood Li Xianzi's feelings. Even though the other party was a respected scholar, he still turned his head and scolded him before kicking him. The dignified scholar of the directorate had been kicked by the Minister of Revenue. The atmosphere in the hall suddenly became a little quiet. Mad. Official Qin was really mad. The people from the directorate were so agitated that they even forgot to help Elder Wu up. The Minister of War, Yin Bing, finally revealed a shocked expression. He had never thought that Qin Huan, who had always been known as a gentleman, would have such a violent side. Yin Bing admitted defeat to beating the directorate's great scholar in front of His Majesty. Li Han sniffled and looked at the scene in front of him. He suddenly had a bad premonition. Before anyone could say anything, Qin Huan picked up the memorial and handed it to an official of the directorate. With a trace of disappointment on his face, he said, "Take a look, all of you." There happened to be a professor of mathematics in the hall today. When he saw Minister Qin's appearance, he felt a chill in his heart and moved his head closer. A moment later, the professor's forehead was covered with a fine layer of sweat. He raised his head and wanted to say something, but his lips were trembling and he couldn't make a sound. Plop! The dignified professor of mathematics of the directorate collapsed to the ground with his legs weak. "Professor Su, what's wrong? What happened? Say something." "Professor Su, Professor Su." The official of the directorate shook Professor Su's shoulder anxiously, only to find that his face was pale and his eyes were lifeless. He didn't say a word. Minister of War Yin Bing, who was standing to the side, seemed to think of something. His face suddenly turned pale. When he looked at Qin Huan, he found that Qin Huan was looking at him with pity. His heart gradually sank into a bottomless abyss. Seeing that Emperor Jing was still a little confused, Qin Huan picked up the memorial and walked in front of Li Han. He said respectfully, "Your Highness Prince Jin, please tell us again." Even if Prince Jin was young and ignorant, he knew that something big had happened. He didn't want to show off anymore and ran out of the door. "Father, I suddenly remembered that Lady Mother was looking for me. I'll go back first." After running a few steps out of the hall, he was caught by the guards. Prince Jin said with some annoyance, "I've written it clearly. Why can't you understand it? I don't have time to tell you again. I have to go back to eat. Today was obviously not a good time to discuss with his father about not going to the mathematics class in the future. His father and those people looked at him strangely. Prince Jean decided to run away first. Your Majesty, the method used by Prince Jean can save nearly 10,000 taels of silver just by transporting grain. I believe that County Magistrate Lee's new mathematics is not only suitable for this. The officials of the Directorate are doing nothing but doing nothing. They have eyes but failed to recognize Emingzu. It's a big mistake. Although Qin Huan calmed down, his tone was still angry. Honor, does teacher teach you these things in class? Emperor Jing thought for a moment, looked down at Prince Jean, and asked. Thinking of the difficult problems in the booklet, Prince Jean shook his head and said, This is nothing. Teacher's teaching is much more difficult than these. Emperor Jing touched his head with a smile and said, Father knows. Honor, go back first. Father has something important to discuss with these officials. Li Han felt as if he had been pardoned and ran out quickly. We are guilty. When Prince Jean stepped out of the hall, all the people of the Directorate knelt down and said in a trembling voice, Chapter 456. The people of the Directorate, who were filled with righteous indignation and wanted to abolish the new mathematics, could only kneel in the hall and did not dare to raise their heads. The three elders, including the great scholar who was kicked to the ground by Qin Huan, the Minister of Revenue, did not kneel together, but their faces were red with shame. Their decades of reputation had been ruined. If there was a crack in the ground in front of them, they would have crawled into it. The words they used to belittle Li Yi just now could be used on them at this moment. Apart from being frightened, they also found it hard to believe. Was the new mathematics so wonderful that it could make a 9-year-old child surpass a master of mathematics who had been immersed in it for decades? Tell me, what is your fault? After the shock, Emperor Jing's expression had calmed down. He glanced at the people kneeling on the ground and asked lightly, We should follow your Majesty's orders and should not doubt Li Xianzi's new mathematics. The Chancellor of the Directorate said in a trembling voice, The calculation method we use is not as good as County Magistrate Lee's new calculation method, but what the Directorate has obtained is the new calculation method. As for the problem of selecting the best candidate just mentioned by Prince Jean, not only I have never heard of it, but I'm afraid no one in the entire Directorate, or even the whole world, has ever heard of it. However, County Magistrate Lee is indeed a genius. I sincerely ask Your Majesty to allow the Directorate to assign 2 doctors of mathematics to study with the princes. The members of the Imperial College looked at each other for a while and then spoke up one after another. They admitted their mistakes with a sincere attitude and did not mention anything about the admonition just now. They praised the new mathematics and expressed their willingness to learn advanced techniques from Li Xianzi. In summary, the core meaning they wanted to express was that it was not that they were too useless. Everyone had been like this for decades, not only our country, but also other countries. They would not take the blame for the previous mistakes. Li Xianzi was so powerful, so it was better to promote the new mathematics as soon as possible. It was not that they did not want to take the blame, but that they could not bear it at all. According to Lord Qin, the National Treasury lost a terrifying amount of money every year. Even if the Directorate sold itself, it would not be able to pay it back. The Minister of War, Yin Bing, knelt in front of Emperor Jing. His face was ashen as he said in a deep voice, The military expenditure was not calculated accurately. Even if I were to die 10,000 times, I would not be able to atone for my sins. Emperor Jing personally helped him up. He shook his head and said, This matter is not your fault. If we really talk about it, I'm also at fault. I should have let County Magistrate Lee carry out this law in detail. The Ministry of War was not responsible for this. Instead, it was the Directorate that disappointed Emperor Jing. The Directorate is to blame for not paying attention to the new school of mathematics. All officials will be fined a year's salary as punishment. Emperor Jing looked at the people of the Directorate of Studies and said, In addition, immediately summoned the mathematics professors and students of the Directorate of Studies to the palace. I want to see with my own eyes what the mathematics talents of our court are like. He trotted all the way back to his residence. Before Prince Jean Lihan had time to catch his breath, a eunuch issued an edict to summon all the princes and princesses to Bowen Hall. Prince Jean followed the eunuch nervously and saw that several princes were already waiting there. He went forward to ask about the situation and learned that his father was going to test their homework. His heart suddenly thumped. These days, he only cared about wandering in the sea of mathematics. How could he remember other homework? In addition to his brothers and sisters, there were more than a dozen strangers in the hall today. It seemed that they were going to take the exam with them. Prince Jean could not help but feel more nervous. After opening the test paper given to him by a eunuch, Prince Jean was stunned. The next moment, he showed a relaxed expression. Chicken and rabbit questions, well, questions and row questions, these were all left over from a long time ago. It did not take him long to solve the answers. The questions at the back were a little good, but they were copied from the booklet given to him by the teacher. Even the numbers were the same. He could write them with his eyes closed. After a quarter of an hour, Li Han put down his pen. His father was watching from a distance and did not dare to do anything out of line. In boredom, he looked at the people around him. Shining Imperial sister frowned. He must have encountered a problem that he could not solve. This was normal. The things taught by the teacher in class were actually very simple. The real hell was actually that booklet that belonged to him. Li Han still thought that the teacher punished him for bullying Yong Ning. Beside him, Li Mo bit the tip of his pen. It seemed that he did not even solve the first question. He deserved it. He actually dared to laugh at him for being fat. So what if he was fat? Being fat did not block his way. This time, he was going to lose face in front of his father. Li Xiang, who was next to him, also seemed to have encountered a problem. Li Xiang had always been his loyal follower, so he had to help him no matter what. He would think of a way to let him copy later so that he did not follow him in vain. What were those strangers doing? Why were their foreheads sweating? There were so many ice cubes, but the Bowen Hall was not hot at all. What a group of strange people. Just as Li Han was sitting there drowsily out of boredom, the students of the Imperial College's mathematics department were already drenched in sweat. Looking at the test paper in front of them, they only felt dizzy. Li Lei, Han Mimi, the pond, releasing water, entering water. Were these really math questions? With doubts about life. Everyone only felt that even the future had become gray. In a secluded corner of the hall, Jing Emperor and the Minister of Revenue, Qin Huan, stood there with a test paper in their hands. The people of the Imperial College stood aside obediently. They had long lost their arrogance. Your Majesty, the questions that Li Xianzi has set are really brilliant. They can be used in reality. They make mathematics not just stay on paper. It can be imagined that if the new mathematics can be implemented, it will create a whole new situation. Qin Huan finally looked away from the test paper and said with admiration, as the Minister of Revenue, he was extremely sensitive to numbers and was naturally proficient in mathematics. At this moment, he finally couldn't help but speak. Jing Emperor nodded and was not too surprised. He had long been used to Li Yi, who could always create miracles and surprises. Your Majesty, 1 hour is up. Yin Bing stepped forward and reminded. Then let's go and take a look. The princes, princesses, and the mathematics students were all driven out of the Bowen Hall. Except for Prince Jean, almost all the princes and princesses were a little nervous. The questions just now were much more difficult than what they usually did in class. Some of them were even unprecedented. They didn't even move a word. This time, they would definitely be reprimanded by their father. Li Mo, how did you answer? Li Xiang, how about you? Did you understand the hand gestures I showed you just now? Imperial Sister, oh, nothing. The red hairpin you are wearing today is so beautiful. After asking everyone, Li Han finally couldn't suppress the pride on his face. Compared to I in mathematics, you are still far behind. Not far away, several young people from the mathematics department of the Imperial College gathered together. They all had bitter faces. Brother Chun, how was it? How many of the 10 questions did you solve? I'm ashamed. I only answered three lines. Not bad, not bad. I only wrote 2 lines. To tell you the truth, I only solved one. Everyone was still confused about His Majesty's inexplicable mathematics exam. Just now, when they saw the questions on the test paper, they felt like they were sitting on pins and needles. At this time, when they learned that everyone's situation was the same, they felt a little relieved. They had never heard of those questions before. Even if they couldn't answer them, it was understandable. Everyone's level was similar, so no one could laugh at each other. It was just strange why His Majesty let these princes and princesses take the exam with them. They were just some naughty children. Did they know what mathematics was? They probably couldn't even understand those questions, right? As the students were thinking about this, they suddenly saw several professors coming out of the hall. The leader of the group, CE, had a gloomy expression, causing them to have a bad premonition. Chapter 457. The dignified mathematics students of the Imperial College are not even as good as the young princes. What a good Imperial College! The Minister of Revenue, Qin Huan, came out of the hall and said with a sullen face. The officials of the Imperial College lowered their heads and did not dare to say a word to refute. Today, the Imperial College lost face in front of His Majesty. It was the same exam, but the mathematics students' results were comparable to a group of 7- or 8-year-old princes. Moreover, they were left far behind by the slightly older Princess Xiaoning and Prince Jean. If this matter was spread out, the Imperial College would not be able to raise their heads in front of people in the future. Teacher, a student summoned up the courage to ask a doctor of mathematics. The other party coldly said with a sullen face, "Why are you still standing here? Haven't you lost face enough? Go back." The mathematics students, who were confused after being scolded, saw the faces of several teachers. They immediately did not dare to say another word and left with their tails between their legs. An incredible thought emerged in the hearts of more than a dozen people at the same time. Could it be that the little princes and princesses really solved those abnormal problems that even they could not solve? They wanted to ask, but when they saw the cold faces, they did not dare to speak. When they thought of what Minister Qin had just said, they only felt that their faces were burning in the Bowen Hall. The princes and princesses lowered their heads and surrounded Emperor Jing. They knew that their father, the emperor, would not be satisfied with this exam, so they carefully did not dare to speak. As for Prince Jean, Li Han, he raised his head high and looked at the world with disdain. As the only person who answered all 10 questions correctly, he had such confidence. Princess Xiaoning was the most lively. She did not seem to care at all. She put an iced grape into Emperor Jing's mouth and asked with a smile, "Father, this grape is very sweet, right?" Emperor Jing smiled, looked at the crowd, and said, "Father is very satisfied with this exam. Don't stand here, go and play." The princes and princesses were relieved when they didn't hear the admonishment they had imagined. In an instant, they dispersed. Only Prince Jean, Li Han, stayed. He looked up at Emperor Jing as if he had something to say. "Han, is there anything else?" Emperor Jing looked at Li Han and asked with a smile. When Li told him that Prince Jean was very talented in mathematics, he didn't care much. However, this time, he deeply realized that the former gluttonous and playful little fatty was actually taught to this degree by Li. Imperial father, I think. Li Han was hesitating whether or not to tell his imperial father that he didn't want to attend math classes in the future. Emperor Jing once again smiled and said, "Your teacher once told imperial father that Han is very talented in math. Han should be more diligent in the future. Perhaps imperial father will need Han-er's help in many areas." What? Monarch Jean was obviously shocked by the news, and he was stunned. Teacher had told father that he was very talented in mathematics? How is this possible? Teacher only knew how to torture him with those difficult questions. Why would he praise him in front of his father? Seeing that Monarch Jean was stunned, Emperor Jing touched his head and said, Okay, Han, what's the matter? Say it quickly, no. Imperial father, I'm going out to play. This accident made him forget what he was going to say. Monarch Jin's face showed a proud expression. He grabbed a few grapes from the plate on the side and ran out of the hall. Emperor Jing smiled and watched him run away. When his eyes fell on the stack of examination papers again, his face gradually showed a thoughtful expression. "Why are you here?" Li Yi looked at Li Xian, who came in from the outside, and asked in surprise. "It's boring to stay in the prince's residence, so I came to take a look," Li Xian said casually, but he looked at the things in Li Yi's hands. He curiously asked, "What are you doing? Aren't you grounded?" Li Yi asked in confusion. "Yes." Li Xian nodded and looked at Li Yi strangely. "Does it matter?" "It doesn't matter." Li Yi shook his head. Even the world belonged to their big family. Being grounded was just a casual remark from the old emperor. It had nothing to do with whether Li Xian was in the prince's mansion or not. Li Xian looked at the rags in Li Yi's hands and lost interest in them. He ran out of the kitchen to get a pot of grape wine and moved a chair to sit next to Li Yi. He took a sip and said, "When I was a child, I was always bullied by the king of Shu. This time, I finally got revenge. If there are such good things in the future, remember to call me." "Come on." He lowered his head and continued to work. He didn't even look at him. He said, "How you fight with the king of Shu is the royal family's business. If I beat the king of Shu again, who knows where my head will be." "Then why were you so bold last time?" Li Xian turned to look at him. He was still very curious about this matter. Hysteria, Li Yi said in a serious tone. He then asked, "How's the activity in the court these few days?" "Nothing much." Li Xian shook his head and said, "The king of Shu is not honorable himself in this matter, so those people won't make a big deal out of it. Other than the initial clamor to severely punish the two of us, no one has talked about it in the court these days." "Those people." Li Yi raised his eyebrows and suddenly became interested. He asked, "Who are they?" "Who?" Li Xian looked at him and said, "Of course it's Prime Minister Qin and those officials close to the king of Shu." That day, they were also the ones who made the most noise in the court, such as the assistant minister of the Ministry of Rights, the chancellor of the directorate. "Wait a minute. What are you going to do?" Seeing Li Yi suddenly get up and walk into the room, Li Xian asked in confusion. "Get a pen and paper." After a while, seeing that Li Yi actually took out a small booklet, Li Xian was stunned. "Does anyone have anything else to report?" The morning court was about to end. Emperor Jing sat on the dragon chair and asked as usual. There were not many things worth discussing in the court today, except for the fact that the third prince of the Qi kingdom had brought a group of capable people from the Qi kingdom to stir up trouble in the capital city. They had visited all the famous Confucian scholars, causing all the Confucian scholars to feel insecure and simply shut themselves in their rooms. However, there was nothing he could do about it. He couldn't just chase them all out. After all, they didn't go overboard in their actions. They discussed knowledge openly and won fair and square. Even if there were many rumors about this among the people, the confidence that they gained from defeating the kingdom of Qi was greatly reduced. Standing at the level of the imperial court, there was no effective way to reverse or change the situation. "I have a report." The assistant minister of the Ministry of Rights, Chun Bo, walked out of the crowd with a ceremonial tablet in his arms. He said loudly, "I heard that the county magistrate of Chong, Li Yi, was ordered by His Majesty to teach mathematics to the princes. However, County Magistrate Li is only a scholar. The new mathematics that he advocated is crooked and has been rejected by the Imperial College. How can a mere scholar teach the princes? It is not in accordance with etiquette and etiquette." Assistant Minister Chun from the Ministry of Rights said a lot. The officials had different thoughts. Emperor Jing was expressionless. The Chancellor of the Imperial College's mouth twitched. He wished he could sew Assistant Minister Chen's mouth. The Imperial College had just lost face in front of His Majesty the previous day. Several mathematics professors spent the night studying the new mathematics. After all, this time it was pardonable, but if something were to happen again, it would not be just a punishment of a year's salary forfeiture. Assistant Minister Chen's words undoubtedly dragged the Imperial College out again and roasted them on the fire. Chapter 458. The Assistant Minister of the Ministry of Rights, Chun Bo, stood out to make things difficult for Li Xianzi, which was not unexpected. As an important figure in Duke Qin's mansion and a staunch supporter of the king of Shu, Chen Bo could not convict Li Xianzi of beating up a prince, but he had to find a way to do something about it. However, they did not expect that he would choose to break through like this, which was really unexpected. Even if Li Xianzi really had great talent, he was too young. He was neither the Grand Tutor nor the Grand Tutor. Of course, he was not a famous Confucian scholar. However, it was indeed difficult for him to be the teacher of the princes at such a young age, because many times being young was a mistake. Oh, this is the imperial court. Assistant Minister Chun, you have to have evidence to speak. How can Li Xianzi's new mathematics be crooked? Suddenly, a voice came out of the silence, which attracted the attention of the people. Minister Qin, seeing that figure, the officials were immediately filled with doubts. The first person to stand up for Li Xianzi was not Li Mingze, the assistant minister of the Ministry of Personnel, nor Yin Bing, the minister of war, nor the old general who was very protective of him. It was Minister Qin of the Ministry of Revenue. Not only were the officials surprised, but Chen Bo also did not expect that the Minister of Revenue, who had never participated in the struggle in the imperial court, would suddenly intervene. Depressed, he said again, Minister Qin, whether my words have evidence or not, you only need to ask Minister Zheng of the Imperial College. Working in the imperial court, the most terrible thing was to be isolated and helpless. He had long expected that there would be opposition, and a few days ago, Chen Bo found himself a reliable ally. The Chancellor of the Imperial College was more qualified than him to speak on this matter in the entire imperial court. Hearing this, the officials could not help but secretly despise him. In the imperial court, everyone knew that the Chancellor of the Imperial College was a disciple of Prime Minister Qin and also a staunch supporter of the King of Shu. How could he stand up for Li Xianzi at this time? In that case, Minister Zheng, how crooked is Li Xianzi's new mathematics? At this time, Emperor Jing's voice came out. The Chancellor of the Directorate felt extremely bitter in his heart. If it were not for yesterday's incident, he would definitely stand on the side of Assistant Minister Chen Bo of the Ministry of Rights. But the problem was that the Directorate of the Directorate had a guilty conscience. The Emperor had already given them a chance yesterday. If they did not grasp it well, not only would he lose his position as Chancellor, but the entire Directorate of the Directorate would also be finished. Chen Bo, the Assistant Minister of Ministry of Rights, was originally smiling confidently. But as the Chancellor of the Imperial College spoke, his smile froze and his face gradually turned pale. He turned his head and looked at Chancellor Zheng, who was still speaking highly of Li Xianzi. His mind went blank. He did not understand. They had agreed that after he brought up this topic, Chancellor Zheng would stand up and denounce the new mathematics. At that time, there would be countless colleagues who would speak up and push this matter to the end. This was the first step to deal with Li Yi. Only after this step was taken could the subsequent plan be carried out. But what was Chancellor Zheng putting on this show again? After Chancellor Zheng spoke, the officials were also stunned. Did Chancellor Zheng take the wrong medicine today? Why did he speak up for the county magistrate of Chang'an? Or did he have a grudge against Chen Bo? But weren't he and Assistant Minister Chen close to the King of Shu? Why would he embarrass Assistant Minister Chen in front of His Majesty and the officials? Among the officials, Chen Qing and Chen Cheng frowned. This was because Chen Bo had not only lost his face, but also the face of the Chen family. What was wrong with Chancellor Zheng? Why did he suddenly change sides? In front of the officials, Prime Minister Qin was expressionless. It was impossible to tell whether he was happy or angry. However, many officials looked at the Chancellor of the Imperial College with slightly angry expressions. His performance today had completely exceeded their expectations. Minister Chen, do you have anything else to say? After the Chancellor of the Imperial College finished speaking, Emperor Jing looked at Chen Bo and asked again, I have nothing to say. Chen Bo's face turned green and white. He gritted his teeth and spoke. Not long after, the officials walked out of the hall one after another. Chancellor Zheng stood in front and wanted to explain to Assistant Minister Chen. Unexpectedly, when Assistant Minister Chen walked past him, He only snorted coldly and strode away. He stood in the same place, and his expression changed for a while. Finally, he flicked his sleeves and left. 10 more days. Li Yi counted the days with his fingers. He turned his head to look at Li Xian and said, "Why don't you go into the palace and tell His Majesty that Yongning's condition has just improved? The environment in the palace is harmful to her condition. Can she be taken out for treatment?" Li Xian rolled his eyes at him and said, "I am still grounded by Uncle Huang and can only stay in the Crown Prince's residence. How can I go into the palace to see him?" Li Yi shook his head. It seemed that he could not rely on this matter. However, he had waited for a year. A few more days did not matter. He lowered his head and continued to busy himself with the work at hand. Outside the courtyard, there was the sound of light footsteps approaching. "Martial uncle." Yang Liuqing stood at the door with a smile on his face. When Li Yi and Rui and Li Yi came to the capital from Qing, in prefecture, Yang Liuqing did not go with them. He stayed in Qing, in prefecture, to help with the matters of the hero list. Mississippi Lu's female army also stayed there. This time, they came with Wan Ruoqing. Other than them, the real backbone of the brothel had completed the transfer from Qing, in prefecture, to the capital. Old Sun, who was eager to develop, had long been impatient with them. Wan Ruoqing did not come to the Viscount's manor. Instead, she had Yang Liuqing bring a letter. "It's finally here." Li Yi finished reading her letter and put it back into the envelope. He raised his head to look at the distant sky and murmured in a low voice, "It's your luck to be able to enter the Qin manor. Keep your eyes open and work honestly. Don't look at things you shouldn't see, and don't ask things you shouldn't ask. Otherwise, getting kicked out would be a light punishment. Do you all hear me?" In the Qin manor, a fat housekeeper stood with his hands on his hips. He pointed at the dozen or so new servants in the manor. "Yes," the servants said timidly. "Speak louder. Have you all not eaten?" the fat housekeeper asked with a frown. "Yes." "Qin Gui, what are you doing?" a voice came from behind. The fat housekeeper turned his head to look. In the next moment, a flattering smile appeared on his serious face. He said, "Fifth Master, the manor has been short on manpower recently. These are the new batch of servants we hired today." With that, he turned his head again. He looked at the group of servants and said, "Open your eyes wide and look carefully. This is the fifth master of the family. Quickly greet the fifth master." Hearing this, the new servants hurriedly bowed to the fifth master of the Qin manor. "Housekeeper Gui, where do you want to put these bags?" At this time, a figure with only half his head exposed walked over from behind. He carried several large bags on his shoulders and turned his head to ask the fat housekeeper, "Kitchen, kitchen. How many times do I have to say it? Put in the kitchen." The fat housekeeper kicked the man's butt and said, "You only grow your body, but who knows where your brain has gone?" "Okay." The large man didn't get angry after being kicked. He responded and continued forward. "Wait a moment." The Qin clan's fifth master suddenly spoke. He looked at him and asked, "What is your name?" Reply to master, "This little one is Wu Er." The man replied with a simple and honest smile. The housekeeper, called Qin Gei, hastily said, "Fifth master, this is the distant nephew of Old Man Wu, who repairs the garden. He came to seek shelter with Old Man Wu. I saw that he had some strength, so I had him come to the manor to do some odd jobs to eat." The Qin clan's fifth master thought for a moment and said, "I just happen to be lacking someone who can use strength. You can make the arrangements." Qin Gui was stunned for a moment. Then he immediately nodded and said, Okay. Don't worry, fifth master. I will make the arrangements in a moment." Having said that, he kicked the man's butt and said, "What are you waiting for? It is your good fortune that fifth master has taken a fancy to you. Hurry up and thank fifth master." The man gave a simple smile and promptly said, "Thank you, fifth master." "Thank you, fifth master." The Qin clan's fifth master waved his hand and turned to leave. The fat housekeeper looked at the man and smacked his lips. He said, "Following fifth master is much better than doing odd jobs. Boy, you are really lucky." The other servants all looked at the large man with envious expressions. He had just entered the Qin manor and was already valued by an old master. His starting point was much, much higher than theirs. The man didn't seem to care about this. He carried the bags on his back and left with a simple smile. After walking 2 steps, he turned back and scratched his head with one hand. He asked, "Housekeeper Gouet, I forgot to ask. Where are these bags?" Chapter 459. Young Master, there are several people outside, saying that they are from the Imperial College. They want to see you. They have been waiting there for almost an hour. Fong leaned against the gate of the courtyard and looked inside. Imperial College? Li did not raise his head. Wasn't the Imperial College a firm supporter of the King of Shu? Why did they come to see him? Did they bring any gifts? I don't think so. Fong thought for a moment, then shook his head and said, "Then tell them that I'm not here. Let them go." Li waved his hand impatiently. It was their first time to visit, and they did not even know the most basic etiquette. How could they be called Imperial College doctors? Where are all the books of sages and sages? Didn't the sages teach them to bring gifts when visiting others? Fong took the order and walked out of the gate. He said to the people beside the carriage, "My young master is not here. You can leave." "He's not here." The professors from the Imperial College looked at each other in dismay. Li Xianzi was grounded at home by His Majesty and could not go anywhere. Even if he wanted to brush them off, he should at least find a decent reason. People under the eaves had to lower their heads. No matter how angry they were, they still had to maintain etiquette. They cupped their hands and said, "Please help us to inform him that the Imperial College Doctors of Arithmetic are here to learn new arithmetic from Li Xianzi by His Majesty's order." "Do you guys not understand what I'm saying?" Fong said impatiently. "My young master said that he is not here. You'd better go back to where you came from." After saying that, Fong turned around and walked inside. He did not forget to remind the 2 guards at the gate. In the future, keep your eyes open. Don't just come in and inform anyone, especially those who don't bring gifts. Yes, Supervisor Fong. Fong was now the supervisor of the guards of the Viscount Mansion. Naturally, the 2 guards did not dare to have any objection. Supervisor Fong even dared to reprimand the Imperial College doctors. If they annoyed him, they would definitely suffer. Arrogant. He's too arrogant. A middle-aged man dressed in green had an ashen expression on his face. The directorate of the directorate and the doctor had personally come to visit a county magistrate, but they didn't even enter the main gate. What kind of contempt and humiliation was this? Forget it, forget it. Let's go back first. The leader, Ce, waved his hand and said helplessly, "Given county magistrate Li's temperament, today's cold reception was within his expectation." A few days ago in the Imperial Court, the Directorate of Imperial Academy had impeached County Magistrate Li a lot. Of course, it was impossible for County Magistrate Li to welcome him with a smile. However, he did not expect that the other party would be so resolute. The few of them did not even cross the threshold of the Viscount Mansion. In any case, they had to meet Li Xianzi. They couldn't guarantee that their brains wouldn't be intact if they made a mistake in the calculation next time. For the sake of his own head and for the future of the directorate, he had no choice but to swallow his anger. He could only prepare a generous gift the next day before paying a visit. Holding a big doll in her arms, Xiao Huan stood behind Li Yi and watched him busy. On such a hot day, she was unwilling to put down the doll sewn for her by the son-in-law. She held a small doll in her arms and a big one on the bed, which was stuffed with rags. It was very comfortable to sleep with it at night. She used to sleep with the first Mississippi. Later, with the son-in-law, she could only sleep alone. When it was cloudy and thundering, she would be too scared to sleep. These days, she slept much more peacefully with the doll in her arms. "Son-in-law, I've sent those people away." Fong came in from outside again and said, "I think they will come again. What if they bring gifts next time? Then leave the gifts and send them away." He was thinking about whether the bow on the sheep's horns was on the left or the right. So he said casually, "Oh." Lao Fong nodded and said, "If there's nothing else, I'll go to Old Sun's place to help him. If you need anything, send someone to call me at the brothel in the city." Li waved his hand and said, "Go." "There's nothing here." Remember to take a bath when you come back. There's no smell of perfume in the brothel. After a while, Fong went out of the mansion with a smile on his face. He had to go to the brothel. Otherwise, it would be hard to explain to his wife at home. If there was a chance, he would help the second miss and find a few top martial arts masters to fight. At that time, he would have something to boast about to Xiao Hong. Is it left or right? If it's only one side, it's not symmetrical. Will it look a little uncomfortable? Looking at the son-in-law who began to talk to himself again, the little maid was a little worried. The son-in-law seemed to be a little strange these days. Did they really say so? In the hall of diligent government, Emperor Jing frowned and asked, I haven't had time to submit the memorial of the envoy of the Qi Kingdom to your majesty. An old man dressed in green said, These days, they have even spread this matter wantonly in the marketplace. Whether your majesty agrees or not, they won't suffer any losses. If your majesty agrees, then we will inevitably have to compete with them again. If your majesty disagrees, I'm afraid that it will greatly damage the prestige of our empire. This is also what they want to see. Even if I agree, what are our chances of winning? Emperor Jing pondered for a moment and said. The old man smiled bitterly and said, I'm afraid the chances of winning are not big. Prime Minister Qin lost in scripture, Wang Zhong lost in poetry, and Bai Yu played chess with an old man and lost all 3 games. Even if we compete again, we will lose more than we win, let alone the others. There are only a few people in the Qi Kingdom. Is there really no one in the Jing Kingdom who can be used? Emperor Jing asked with a sullen face. The old man shook his head and said, Your Majesty, you are wrong. Everyone knows that Prime Minister Qin lost in scripture, poetry, Ghost lost in poetry, and Bai Yu lost in chess. But they don't know that the nameless old man who competed with Prime Minister Qin is the famous great literary master of the Qi Kingdom 30 years ago. He disappeared and devoted himself to literature for 30 years. How can Prime Minister Qin easily defeat him? In addition, the young man who competed with Wang Zhong in poetry is known as the greatest poet in the past millennium in the Qi Kingdom. He is called the Poetry Saint at a young age. He is more than 10 years younger than Wang Zhong and is at the age when his mind is agile. It is not surprising that he won against Poetry Ghost. Bai Yu's loss was not unjust either. Even his father could not defeat that person back then. The chess soul of the great Qi dynasty had never lost a single time since he was young. How could he live up to his reputation? The old man sighed and said, This time, they came with the envoy of the Qi Kingdom. It is obvious that they want to embarrass the Jing Kingdom in front of the people of the world. They want to win back the face of the defeat on the battlefield. The great literary master of the generation calls himself a nameless old man. The young poetry saint says, I am not talented. The famous chess soul of the various countries only says I have played chess for a few years and know a little. What can we do? Being inferior was being inferior. Whether the opponent was the great literary master or the poetry saint, they had suppressed the people of the Jing Kingdom. It did not matter who they were. The only thing that mattered was that the people of the Qi Kingdom had come to bully them. Should they accept the challenge or not? I don't believe that there is not a single capable person in the vast capital city. After an unknown period of time, Emperor Jing snorted coldly. He waved his sleeve and said, Go and ask them how they want to compete. Chapter 460. One day, after the morning assembly, a piece of news spread like wildfire in the marketplace. The emperor had agreed to the Qi Kingdom's request for a duel. The duel would be held in the palace the next day. Streets and alleys, brothels. Countless people in the capital city were discussing this matter. Damn the people of the Qi Kingdom. How dare they come to our capital city and behave atrociously? We should have taught them a lesson long ago. They want to challenge the entire capital city with just a few people. How arrogant! Tomorrow will be the day to avenge themselves. These days, from the officials and nobles to the commoners, everyone in the capital city had been holding their breaths. Prime Minister Qin had lost, Shi Gui had lost, and the chess saint had lost. They had lost to a few nobodies from the Qi Kingdom. As citizens of the Jing kingdom, they felt humiliated. Not only were they humiliated, but they also felt aggrieved. They felt aggrieved because they did not use any underhanded tricks at all. Instead, they fought fair and square. With just a few people, they had forced the Confucians to close their doors and hide in their homes, not daring to meet anyone. Even the peddlers selling steamed buns on the street felt ashamed. Now, they could finally regain their dignity and regain their confidence. Everyone was looking forward to defeating those arrogant people in a fair and square manner tomorrow. The people of Qi are arrogant. With just a few people, they want to challenge the entire Jing kingdom. Tomorrow will be the first round of the duel. Is there anyone willing to accept the challenge on behalf of the Jing kingdom? Emperor Jing sat steadily on his throne in the Golden Hall, his gaze sweeping across the officials as he spoke in a clear voice. The generals looked around, their expressions relaxed, as if they did not care at all. The duel tomorrow was a battle of words and had nothing to do with them. It was a matter for the rotten Confucians. They just had to wait and watch the show. Their true battlefield was during martial arts battles. The civil officials lowered their heads, afraid that they would be singled out. They did not dare to meet the emperor's eyes. The Qi kingdom's envoy was despicable and cunning. The old man who had said that he had played chess for a few years and only knew a little was a national player. Even the chess saint Baiyu had lost. Who in the imperial court would dare to say that they could win? Baiyu was in the prime of his life and was at the peak of his chess skills. He was publicly acknowledged as the #1 player in the Jing kingdom, yet even he was no match for that person. Who else would dare to step forward at this moment? If they were to lose, they would become a sinner of the Jing kingdom and their reputation would be ruined. No one was willing to take this risk. For a moment, the court, which was supposed to be extremely noisy, fell into a rare silence. Is there really no one in our dynasty who dares to fight? Emperor Jing looked disappointed. In fact, when the envoy of the Qi kingdom made this request, he only had one choice. All the subjects and people in the capital, including the envoys of other countries, were watching another collision between the Qi kingdom and the Jing kingdom onto the battlefield. The significance of this competition was related to the backbone of the country and the integrity of the people. It was no less important than a war. Whether the Jing kingdom would surpass the Qi kingdom again and gain great fame or be suppressed by the Qi kingdom, and the people would suffer a setback, no matter what the result was, the Jing kingdom could not avoid this competition or the competition. Sigh. Suddenly, a sigh was heard in the silent court. A figure walked in from outside the hall, trembling. He bowed to Emperor Jing twice and said, "Your Majesty, I am willing to fight." A eunuch supported the old man with a terrified face. The guards at the door did not even dare to stop him. "Grand Tutor Wang." No, Your Majesty, Grand Tutor is old. This must not be done." When this old man with white hair and a face full of wrinkles stood out, the officials were stunned for a moment. They immediately burst into an uproar and tried to dissuade him. Grand Tutor Wang was over 80 years old and had served several generations of emperors. In terms of seniority, he was much older than Prime Minister Qin and Prime Minister Shun. He was one of the few old men in the court and did not usually have to attend court. No one knew why he was making exception today. If this old man were to play chess with the people of Qi, the civil and military officials of the Jing kingdom would not be able to face others in the future. "Teacher, why are you? Please have a seat." Emperor Jing stood up from the dragon throne and hurriedly ordered the guards to bring a chair. The old man did not sit down, but continued to bow and said, "I am not talented, but I have played chess for a few years. Since no one in the imperial court is willing, why don't you let me play? I hope your Majesty agrees." Emperor Jing walked down from the throne and said with a bitter smile, "Teacher, why do you have to do this?" The old man sighed and said, "We cannot let outsiders think that there is no one in the Jing kingdom." When the old man's aged voice sounded, the officials looked ashamed. At this moment, a figure walked out from the crowd and bowed and said, "Your Majesty, I am willing to fight." Deputy Prime Minister Ma. Why would Deputy Prime Minister Ma? That's right, only Ma Zhongqing can do it. Ma Zhongqing and Chess Saint Baiyu are best friends, and the two of them often play chess together. Bai once said that if the two of them were to play seriously, the outcome would be uncertain. The person who stood out at the right time was the Deputy Prime Minister of the Imperial Censor. Li Yi seemed to be moved. He finally looked up at him and waved the thing in his hand in front of him. He asked, "Do you think one bow tie is better or two?" Chapter 461. The capital was rather quiet that day. Even the hawkers on the streets were much quieter than usual. Every now and then, people would look up in the direction of the palace, thinking about the match that was going on there. The match against the people of the Qi Kingdom was a battle of honor. As citizens of the Jing Kingdom, driven by their national pride and national honor, everyone was very concerned about this matter. Some underground gambling dens even opened bets for this match. In the bustling gambling dens, countless people raised their heads in anticipation, waiting for the news to spread from the palace. In the Viscount's residence, Li Yi woke up early. He had to supervise the two tailors to work quickly. In 2 days, when the boring match against the people of the Qi Kingdom was over, his period of confinement would come to an end. He had to finish these 2 items before entering the palace. At this time, in the Golden Hall, 2 people sat cross-legged on both sides of a chessboard. On one side was Deputy Ma, and on the other was an old man with white hair and a face full of wrinkles. Today was the first match of the written examination, and it was of utmost importance. Even Emperor Jing could not sit firmly on the throne. He walked down from above, but did not get too close, watching from afar. Apart from Emperor Jing, there were only a few people in the hall. The 2 prime ministers were among them, and there were also a few old men, all famous scholars of the dynasty. On the other side, there were also several people standing behind the old man. They were all ambassadors of the Qi Kingdom, and their leader was a young man who looked to be in his early 20s. In order not to disturb the 2 people playing chess, most of the officials waited outside the hall. Countless people paced in the square, their expressions faintly anxious. Deputy Ma was in the prime of his life. It was reasonable to say that both his chess skills and physical strength were at the peak of his life. Even Chess Saint Bayu did not dare to underestimate him. Against an old man, no matter how one looked at it, he had a great advantage. However, not long ago, when Chess Saint Bayu played against this old man, they thought the same. But in the end, Bayu lost all 3 matches. Today, would Deputy Ma be able to turn the tide and win the first city for the country? This was the worry of the officials and Emperor Jing, not something that Emperor Jing should be worried about. These are the pastries that Lady Mother asked the catering company to make. They're delicious. Do you want to try them? Prince Jin, Li Han, was holding an exquisite food box in his hand. He squatted on the steps of Shady Place in the palace and said to the little girl sitting there with a smile on his face, "Thank you, Brother Jin. I'm not hungry." The little girl turned her head and looked at the direction of the palace gate. She shook her head and said, "Then I'll leave it here first. You can eat it when you're hungry." Monarch Jean put the lunchbox aside and said cautiously, "Sister Yongning, I used to bully you all the time. It's all my fault. Now I know I was wrong. If anyone dares to bully you in the future, tell me, and I'll beat him up for you." After thinking for a while, he added, "If it's my brother, the King of Shu, I can't beat him, but I'll tell you." However, Princess Yongning didn't seem to hear him. She murmured, "When will my brother come?" Monarch Jean scratched his head and said, "You mean Master? Master has been grounded by Father for half a month. There's still a few days left. He won't come to the palace these days." Princess Yongning looked a little disappointed. She subconsciously hugged her arms and then remembered that the sheep was gone. Monarch Jean glanced in a certain direction and scratched his head. He said, "There seems to be something interesting in the legislative hall today. Sister Shawning and the others have already gone there. Do you want to go with me?" Seeing Yongning shake her head, Monarch Jean stood up and said, "Then I'll leave first." Outside the legislative hall, the officials were still pacing in the square. Several small figures squeezed at the door and poked their heads out to look inside. Before long, another curious head appeared. Inside the hall, as the chess game progressed, Emperor Jing and the others frowned. The wrinkled face of the old man from the state of Qi was expressionless. He was very calm when he picked up a chess piece and placed it down. On the other hand, Deputy Commander Ma's complexion was pale. Beads of sweat had appeared on his forehead. He had been holding a chess piece in his hand for a long time, but he didn't place it down. A hint of defeat flashed across Prime Minister Qin's face. He was about to lose this game. Ma Zhongqing, who could stand shoulder to shoulder with the chess saint, had only lasted for 2 hours against the old man. In the end, he still couldn't avoid losing. Sometimes, a match between experts would last for several hours. For Ma Zhongqing to lose in 2 hours was enough to show the difference in chess skills between the two. If he were to lose again tomorrow, there would be no need for the written examination. I've lost. The chess piece in Ma Zhongqing's hand didn't land in the end. His face was dejected, and he seemed to have aged a little in an instant. He stood up and said in a hoarse voice. Even though he had won, the old man opposite him didn't say a word. He stood up and silently stood opposite the young man. The officials outside the hall filed in. Just by looking at Ma Zhongqing's expression, they already had a conclusion. He had lost. As expected, he had lost. It had only been 2 hours, and the old man had become so powerful. The officials' hearts were heavy. They stood around and didn't say a word. I was lucky to win the first game. Thank you for letting me win. The young man smiled and cupped his hands at the crowd. Emperor Jing was disappointed. He waved his hand and said, "Let's end the court today. Tomorrow, we will continue with the second round of the written examination. Your Majesty, please wait." At this moment, the young man suddenly spoke. "What else do you want?" Emperor Jing looked back at the young man and asked with a frown. The young man smiled and said, "This time, I propose to compete with your kingdom only for the sake of learning from each other. I have no other intentions. I really don't want to cause trouble for your kingdom." The officials frowned when they heard this. He didn't want to cause trouble for his kingdom. Didn't the third prince mean that if the competition continued, the Jing kingdom would continue to lose and lose face? Hearing this, the officials felt more ashamed and resentful than if they had lost the competition. Does the third prince really think that you will win? Before Emperor Jing could speak, Prime Minister Qin snorted coldly and said. The young man smiled and said, "Winning or losing isn't important. The purpose of this competition is to exchange and learn. If we insist on determining who is superior and who is inferior, it would lose its original meaning. I believe that even everyone here doesn't want to determine a winner and a loser, right?" The young man's words made all the officials speechless. If they had won the first round, they would not have allowed the Prince of Qi to speak so much here. The problem was that they had already lost the first round. If they lost the next round, they would not only lose their face, but also the face of the entire Jing kingdom. At that time, what would the commoners think? What would the other kingdoms think? The Qi kingdom had only brought a few people with them, yet they had defeated the Jing kingdom. Could it be that the Jing kingdom's imperial court was filled with a bunch of good-for-nothings? What do you want? At this time, it was not suitable for Emperor Jing to speak. Prime Minister Qin thought for a moment and looked at the young man and asked. The young man looked at Emperor Jing and said, "As long as your country agrees to a small condition of ours, there is no need to continue the competition. After the handover of the city, our envoy will immediately leave the Jing kingdom. What does your Majesty think?" Although he was unwilling to admit it, if the competition continued, the possibility of the Jing kingdom losing face would only be greater. Emperor Jing looked at him and asked, "What is the condition?" "It's very simple. It's just a small request." The young man smiled and said, "There are many people in the envoy group. After staying in the capital for a long time, our travel expenses have been exhausted. We only hope that your Majesty can give us some food, enough for the envoy group to return to the country." "Only food?" As soon as the young man's voice fell, not only was the expression on Emperor Jing's face startled, but the officials also showed an expression of disbelief. When it came to the face of the country, they thought that the third prince of the Qi kingdom would make some unreasonable request. As long as it was a little too much, even if His Majesty agreed, they would still strongly oppose it. But who would have thought that after spending so much effort, it was actually just a little food? For a moment, the expressions of the officials as they looked at the third prince of the Qi kingdom immediately changed subtly. It was said that the third prince of the Qi kingdom was the most capable of all the princes of the Qi kingdom and could be said to be extremely talented. Could it be that the rumors were false? Was the third prince actually the same as the king of Shu? As if not noticing the strange gazes of the officials, the young man pointed to the chessboard at the side and said, "The envoy group does not need much food. As long as Your Majesty sends someone to put 1 grain of rice in the first grid of the chessboard, 2 grains in the second grid, 4 grains in the third grid, and after that, each grid will have twice the amount of rice in the previous grid, and so on. You only need to put the rice on the 64th grid of the chessboard." After the young man finished speaking, he looked at Emperor Jing with a smile, waiting for his reply. Emperor Jing did not reply immediately. He looked at the chessboard at the side and then at the young man. Judging from a performance of the third prince of the Qi kingdom, he was definitely not an ordinary person. This competition had been planned for a long time. So how could it end so hastily? Relying on the food on the 64th grid of the chessboard to return to the Qi kingdom, they would probably starve to death before they reached the Qi kingdom. What do you all think? Emperor Jing looked at the officials around him and asked. Many officials rejoiced in their hearts. They hadn't expected that the third prince of the Qi kingdom would be a fool. This was great news for them. Although there were some who suspected that there might be a scheme behind this, the third prince only wanted some rations. So they could just give it to him. What kind of scheme could he play with a few bags of rations? Your Majesty, since the ambassadors of the Qi kingdom are so short of food, we naturally can't refuse. We can't let the ambassadors of other countries starve. This is not appropriate. Assistant Minister Chan Bo stood up and said with a smile, "Your Excellency Chan is right. If we refuse, it will seem that we are stingy. It's not easy for the third prince to come from afar. Why not satisfy his request?" Things took a turn, and the officials all smiled and spoke. If they could use some food to send away the troublesome people of the Qi kingdom, it was a good deal no matter how they looked at it. At that time, they could say that the people of the Qi kingdom were afraid, so they asked for some food and went back to the Qi kingdom. His Majesty was kind and gave them some food. Not only did they save face, but they also saw the people of the Qi kingdom as a joke. Why not? Where are the professors of mathematics in the Imperial College? Emperor Jing pondered for a moment and suddenly asked. When Chancellor Zheng heard this, he immediately went forward and said, "Your Majesty, except for Professor Han, the other professors of mathematics went to the Li County Mansion to ask for mathematics. They are not in the court." The reason why this Professor Han came today was that he wanted to ask for a proper imperial edict from His Majesty. Otherwise, he would not even be able to enter the gate of the Li family. Chancellor Zheng waved his hand behind him, and immediately a middle-aged man walked over quickly. Emperor Jing was a little regretful. If he knew this, he should have called Li Yi here today. He had never let him down. With him here, why should he worry about these things? Do you know how much food they want? Emperor Jing looked at Professor Han and asked. Professor Han pondered for a moment and said, "Your Majesty, it's only 64 squares. It won't be a lot." Professor Han looked at the chessboard. As a professor of mathematics, he naturally thought more than the other officials. Due to the multiplication, 64 squares were actually not a small number. However, how big was a grain of rice? 1 stone of rice was already innumerable. Even if 64 squares could not be filled, 10 stones would not be enough, and 100 stones would not be enough, right? The Jing kingdom did not lack those 100 or so meters of rice. Using this amount of rice to send off the Qi kingdom's envoy was a very good deal. It was rare for the officials to have the same opinion on this matter. Emperor Jing suppressed the only worry in his heart and said, "In that case, then." The third prince of the Qi kingdom still had a faint smile on his face. The expressions on the officials' faces were also quite satisfied. Everyone was happy and well. Wait a minute. The harmonious atmosphere was suddenly broken by a voice. After being stunned for a moment, everyone turned their heads and looked in the direction of the voice. Prince Jean, Li Han, stood at the door of the hall. When he saw so many people in the hall looking at him, he couldn't help but feel a little scared. But he still forced himself to muster up courage and interrupted Emperor Jing's words, saying, "Father, you can't agree with them." In front of the envoy of the Qi Kingdom and the civil and military officials, Emperor Jing's words were interrupted by Prince Jean, but he was not angry at all. Instead, his face showed a thoughtful expression. The third prince of the Qi Kingdom's expression changed slightly. He looked at the little fat man standing at the door of the hall with a trace of surprise in his eyes. "Your Highness, this is the court. Don't make trouble here." The officials quickly reacted. They didn't care about their identity and spoke out to stop him. This was a great advantage. They must not let Prince Jean ruin it. Next time, they might not meet such a stupid prince. Most of the officials stopped Prince Jean, but a few people's faces changed at the same time. Minister of the Ministry of Revenue Qin Huan, Minister of War Yin Bing, Chancellor of the Imperial College, and the Professor of Mathematics. No one knew better than them how many incredible things were in this fat head. "Honor, come here and talk." Emperor Jing smiled and waved to Prince Jean. Seeing that his father was not angry, Prince Jean was relieved. He walked over slowly, pointed at the young man, and said to Emperor Jing, "Father, don't be cheated by them. My teacher said that all the countries in the world can't fill the 64 squares of the chessboard. If we build a big warehouse to store all the food, the warehouse should be 3 feet long, 6 feet wide, and high as the sun." The third prince of the Qi Kingdom's expression did not change, but he sighed in his heart. For the first time, he looked at the little fat man in front of him seriously. "Yes, there are so many," the Chancellor of the Imperial College said in a trembling voice. The face of Professor Han, who had just spoken, turned pale. He only felt that his eyes were a little black. If it was only Prince Jean, he still had a glimmer of hope in his heart. But the problem was that he just said, "My teacher said." Prince Jin's teacher was none other than the mysteriously Xianzi. He taught Prince Jean, who was a naughty child, to sweep the mathematics students of the Imperial College and make the professors of mathematics extremely ashamed. How could he talk nonsense without any basis? Chapter 462. Prince Jean, are you serious? Qin Huan, the Minister of Revenue, stepped forward and asked Li Han anxiously. "Yes, sir." Li Han casually put the blame on Li Yi. With his current mathematics level, he couldn't handle such a terrible number. A granary as high as the sun was frightening. "Professor Han, are you serious? It's only 64 squares. Are there really so many? Where are the people from the Imperial College? Come out and say something." After a moment of silence, the officials finally reacted when they saw the expressions of several important people, but they still couldn't believe what Prince Jean had just said. A granary as high as the sun was 30 feet long and 20 feet wide. Who was he bluffing? The sun was very far away from here. How did Prince Jean calculate this number? The only mathematics professor from the Imperial College in the court immediately became the focus of everyone's attention. Professor Han trembled and said, Since it's Li Xianzi's words, then it should be correct. Fortunately, I brought it with me." Li Han patted his butt and took out a tattered booklet from his arms. He dipped his saliva in it and quickly flipped through it. This booklet was specially made for him. There were not only strange problems in it, but also interesting stories interspersed every few pages. For Prince Jean, who often struggled in the sea of problems, this was undoubtedly a small island for him to temporarily rest on. Therefore, he still remembered the stories in the booklet. Found it. Prince Jean finally turned to a page and presented it to Emperor Jing. "Father, look, it's here." Emperor Jing looked at the page that Prince Jean had turned to. After a moment, he flicked his sleeves and said, "Since it's a competition, there should be a beginning and an end. If your country's envoys can't gather enough food for the return trip, I will give you travel expenses. Tomorrow's competition will continue as usual. Don't be late." After that, Emperor Jing walked out surrounded by several eunuchs. The officials who finally knew the truth felt their faces burn. They wanted to skin the third prince of the Qi kingdom alive. Shameful, this was a great disgrace. All the civil and military officials in the court were not as good as the 9-year-old Prince Jean. They almost made a big mistake. It was hard to imagine that if His Majesty and them agreed to the third prince's request, the ruler and ministers of the Jin kingdom would become the laughingstock of all the other countries. They naturally wouldn't take out those rations. Not to mention the fact that they didn't have that much rations. Even if they did, they couldn't possibly give it to the Qi kingdom for free. If you want rations, you can just give it to a few Tian Fa heavenly kings. But if he didn't give it to Prince Jean, as the king of a country, how could he go back on his words? Otherwise, how could he stay in other countries in the future? It could be said that if Prince Jean was a moment late, the Jin kingdom would lose its face. The third prince of the Qi kingdom and the envoys walked out of the golden palace under the baptism of the gazes of the officials. There was a hint of disappointment on the face of the young man who was walking in front. If they had succeeded in what they had just done, they could have spread the news before the Jin kingdom reacted. By then, they would have achieved their ultimate goal without having to compete with each other. It seems that I have underestimated the heroes of the world. The young man sighed and said in a regretful tone. One of the envoys behind him said, "So what if they find out? The result will be the same. If they lose another round tomorrow, there will be no need to compete in the written exam. As for the martial arts battle, we are not afraid at all. Why is the third prince sighing?" The young man shook his head and didn't continue this topic. He said, "Find out who the teacher of Prince Jean is." That difficult calculation problem was solved by Grand Scholar Chen. It took more than 10 accountants, 3 days, and 3 nights to calculate the result. I didn't expect there to be such a capable person in the Jin kingdom who knew the secret of it. Otherwise, it's a pity. Seeing the envoy of the Qi kingdom walk out of the grand palace, the anger of the officials because they were fooled by the envoys subsided a little. They had thought that the third prince of the Qi kingdom was a fool, but they didn't expect that they were the real fools. They had almost fallen into his trap. He was so insidious and cunning at such a young age. He wouldn't live long. When he shifted his gaze to Prince Jean, his expression immediately became gentle. Very good. Like father, like son. The 9-year-old Prince Jean had seen through the conspiracy of the envoy of another kingdom in the imperial court and saved the face of His Majesty and the officials. His deed was worthy of being recorded in the annals of history. The officials' joy didn't last long. They realized a serious problem. Though the conspiracy of the envoy of the Qi kingdom had been exposed by Prince Jean, they had already lost the first round of the written examination today. If they lost again tomorrow, there would be no need to compete in the third round. Therefore, the match tomorrow was very important. They couldn't afford to lose. Otherwise, they would lose face sooner or later. The Imperial Academy guard Sai's face darkened. It was his turn to compete tomorrow. In fact, he wasn't sure whether he could win or not. The greatest poet in 1,000 years. This name alone was a bit frightening. Because of the announcement of the envoy of the Qi kingdom, the populace in the capital had already received the news before the officials left the palace. They had lost. They had lost to the Qi kingdom in the first round of the written examination. In the gambling house, countless people were cursing at Ma Zhongqing. This defeat was not a big deal, but many of them would have to bear a huge loss. Many of them would go bankrupt. Who would have thought that the countless capable people in the capital would lose to a nameless old man from the Qi kingdom at their own doorstep? How ironic was this? The enthusiasm of the common people was greatly dampened, and the entire capital was filled with a gloomy atmosphere. Quite a few people blamed this failure on Ma Zhongqing. Rumors spread everywhere, directly labeling Ma Zhongqing as a sinner of the country. No one knew how many rotten eggs and vegetables were thrown over the wall into the Ma Manor. The dignified deputy imperial censor was hit in the forehead by a stone thrown by a naughty child on his way home. After hearing the rumors, he fainted on the spot. Not only that, the populace also had a lot of complaints about the current emperor. Although they weren't as blatant as they were against Ma Zhongqing, They were secretly criticizing His Majesty the Emperor. As Li Yi listened to Li Xian, he reminded the two tailors of the details that they needed to pay attention to. I heard that the third prince of the Qi kingdom had set up a trap for the emperor and the officials in the court. If it weren't for Prince Jin's reminder, we would have lost a lot of face this time. Li Xian's face was full of resentment. If we lose another round tomorrow, we'll lose completely to the Qi kingdom in the written examination. After listening to Li Xian's narration a few times, Li Yi had a general understanding of the so-called contest. It was nothing more than a few high-level players who had played the game to the highest level, pretending to be newbies to bully a group of newbies. Of course, those who could represent the Jin kingdom were not newbies, but it was obvious that there was still a long way to go before they could reach the highest level. The Qi kingdom seemed to be more powerful than the Jin kingdom in terms of economy, culture, and military. It was impossible for the Qi kingdom to win this contest unless someone had cheated. Poor Deputy Imperial Censor Ma, Li Yi sighed. As a dignified Deputy Imperial Censor, what he cared about the most was his own reputation. This time, he was directly called a sinner of the country. It was hard to say if he could get over this hurdle. Judging from the situation, Wei Sai and Grand Scholar Zhou were in danger. Fortunately, the old emperor didn't remember him. Otherwise, he would be scolded to death by those ignorant onlookers. Summon County Magistrate Li to the palace tomorrow morning. As Li Yi was thinking of this, the Jing Emperor said this while waving his hand in the Hall of Diligent Government, while holding a book of poems titled The Collection of Bright Moon in his hand. Chapter 463. Tomorrow's contest is very important. No matter what, I plan to go to the palace to have a look. Li Xian's expression was firm. As a member of the Li royal family, he naturally valued this contest more than ordinary people. After saying that, he turned back to look at Li Yi and said, "Aren't you quite good at writing poems? Can you beat that Millennium Poetry genius? That nickname sounds scary, but I don't know if he's really that good." "Of course," Li Yi said casually. Then he turned to a tailor and said, "Just follow that painting. Don't change anything." So what if he was the best poet in 1,000 years? Fame was not something to brag about. Moreover, the development of poetry in this world had long been led into the gutter by someone. If the former Tang dynasty followed the established historical development, Li Bai, Du Fu, Wang Wei by Ji, any one of these people would be added with the word 10,000 years in front of their titles. King Zhong, the poetry demon, was said to be good at fusing words and galloping at the imagination. That was why he was called the poetry demon. Fortunately, Li Yi's coffin was suppressed. Otherwise, the real poetry demon would jump out and beat people up. They were the true gods of poetry. In terms of poetry, they belonged to another plane of existence compared to this world. Standing on the shoulders of so many great people, how could they not be able to kill a scholar from the Qi kingdom? If he lost, the coffins of those great writers would really be broken. That's true. Li Xian shook his head. Although he did not know much about poetry, he knew that Li Yi was very famous in Qing and prefecture. However, even King Zhong, the poetry demon, admitted that he was not as good as that young man from the Qi kingdom. Li Yi definitely cannot do it. He had indeed asked a superfluous question. "Lord Zhu, do you think this will work?" The two tailors wiped the sweat from their foreheads and looked carefully at this strange Lord Zhu. They had never seen such a huge doll before. Not only did it have a strange shape, it also had a lot of requests. Furthermore, when they were working, this Lord Zhu was watching them and reminding them 10 times every 2 hours. No tailor could stand it. Okay, it's not bad." Li Yi waved his hand and said, "Go to Butler Li to receive your reward." The two tailors felt as if they had been pardoned, and their faces were filled with joy. This lord was not good at all, but his temperament of rewarding without a word was very popular. The two tailors thanked him for a while and immediately went to find Butler Li. Li Xian looked at the two strange things in front of him. He didn't know what was so special about the things that Li Yi had been busy with for the past few days. "Son-in-law, the people from the Imperial College have come again." Fong leaned against the door and said, "They brought gifts this time. and they are quite heavy. I asked the gatekeeper to send a few cups of tea over, and they're still waiting outside. Li Xian asked in confusion. Why are the people from the Imperial College looking for you? Go out and have a look. The people from Imperial College had visited the Viscount's mansion more than 3 times, and the gifts were heavier each time. They also let the people stand outside the door and bask in the sun. It was really unreasonable. At the very least, they should see each other before basking in the sun. Zheng Darren, do we really have to wait like this? Outside the Viscount's mansion, a doctor of mathematics looked at the Chancellor and asked with a bitter face. The rest of the people also looked at him. This was not a slow treatment. They had been visiting for several days, and they had given countless gifts. But today, they could only drink a cup of tea. They didn't even get to enter the door. No one would feel good in their heart. Wait, the Chancellor gritted his teeth. Today, Prince Jin's performance in the court finally made him clearly aware of the difference between the Imperial College and Li Xianzi. Now that His Majesty has realized the importance of the new mathematics, it was okay for the Imperial College to make a mistake once or twice. But if they would be slapped in the face by Prince Jin a few more times, they would lose face. If the Imperial College was abolished, the Chancellor would definitely surpass his predecessors and leave his name in history. Just when everyone was waiting anxiously, a few figures finally appeared at the entrance of the Viscount's mansion. My apologies for the long wait. His Majesty's confinement period hasn't ended yet, so he can't leave the residence. If you have anything to say, please come in and talk. Li Yi stood at the door and said to the people from the Directorate. Li Yi was very clear about how many times these people from the Imperial College had snitched on him. Naturally, he would not treat them as distinguished guests, so he spoke in an indifferent tone. The Chancellor was not surprised by Li Yi's attitude at all. He stepped forward and said with a smile, Under His Majesty's order, I brought the Doctor of Mathematics from the Imperial College to learn the new mathematics from Li Xianzi. For the sake of, since it is His Majesty's order, you can listen to it in the Bowen Hall from now on. Li Yi thought for a moment and said, how free was he to waste time teaching these people? Mathematics was a road of no return. There was only a starting point and no end. When the time came, he could just throw some unreasonable equations and mingle with calculus, and it would be enough for them to study until they retired. Thank you, Li Xianzi. So be it. At least he would feel more at ease. The Chancellor of Kingdom didn't think that County Magistrate Li would put aside his prejudice against them and teach them seriously. He didn't stay any longer. After expressing his gratitude, he left with the Directorate of Kingdom. Li Yi had already heard about Prince Jin Li Han's matter. This kid didn't let me worry about him during the holidays. He made so many things. It must be because he left too little homework. It seemed that it was time to write another booklet. Early in the morning, the sky had just brightened. Li Yi rubbed his sleepy eyes and looked at the 2 eunuchs standing in the yard. He turned around and walked into the house. Oh, the confinement period is not over yet. I'm going back to sleep for a while. Don't wake me up if there's nothing important, and don't wake me up if there's something. Anyone who has woken up before dawn would not be in a good mood. Li Yi yawned a few times and crossed the threshold. His Majesty knew that you would be lazy, so he specially sent this old man here. A gloomy voice came from behind. Chanda grabbed his collar and pulled him back. He said, Li Xianzi, you'd better come with this old man. He nodded slightly to Rui, who was standing on the side, and then dragged Li Yi out of the door. It turned out to be Changda, this old guy. This old guy was quite strong. It seemed that he couldn't sleep in today. When he was dragged away by the old guy, he told Rui to remember to leave some food for him in the morning. The next moment, he was pushed into the carriage. Wait a minute. Seeing the old guy turned over and got on the horse, as if he was going to leave immediately, Li Yi quickly said. Chanda looked back and said, Is there anything else? If His Majesty's important matter is delayed, you and I can't afford to bear the consequences. I'm going back to get something. Li Yi jumped off the carriage and entered the Viscount's mansion. After a while, he came out with 2 things in his arms. Chanda glanced at him and gently waved his whip. The carriage started moving. Chief Chong, the carriage had not entered the city yet, and it was too bumpy to sleep. Li Yi was a little bored. He opened the window and looked at Changda. "Speak," Changda said without turning his head. A trace of curiosity appeared on Li Yi's face. "Can I ask you a question? This old man has never practiced the Sunflower Treasure Book." Not that." Li looked at him and asked, "Why don't you call yourself this old man?" Changda raised his eyebrows. "Why should this old man call himself this old man?" "Bastard scriptwriter." Li Yi rolled down the window, leaned on the sheep doll, murmured and closed his eyes. Chapter 464. After the carriage entered the bluestone streets of the capital, it gradually steadied. Changda waved at the guards at the palace gate, and the carriage went straight into the palace. The happiest thing in the morning was to have a good sleep after waking up. Although sleeping in the carriage was not as comfortable as sleeping on a bed, it was good to have something soft to lean on. Li only woke up when the carriage suddenly stopped and his head bumped into the carriage. He must have seen too many beautiful goats recently. He actually dreamed that he was catching goats on a green grassland. If Changda did not suddenly stop, he would still be fighting with Pleasant Goat in his dream. "County Magistrate Li, it's time to get off." An uncomfortable voice came from outside. Li unwillingly got off the carriage. He looked around and suddenly exclaimed, "Why are we here? His Majesty and a few important officials are at the Hall of Diligent Government. County Magistrate Li, quickly follow me." Changda's voice was always so annoying. "No, I have to go back for a while." He shook his head and said. Changda frowned and asked, "Where?" Li pointed and said, "The palace in front." Changda glanced at the direction and said, "County Magistrate Li, if you want to see Princess Yongning, wait until you see His Majesty first." "No, I don't have the time later." Li sat back on the carriage. Changda smiled sinisterly. "Then don't blame me." With that, he strode towards Li Yi. "What do you want?" "I'm telling you, don't touch me. Let me give you a piece of advice. Don't provoke me. I'm even afraid of myself when I'm angry." "You?" "I am. My head hurts." "Don't tell me my hysteria is acting up again." The smile on Changda's face froze. The 6-year-old girl sat on the stone steps in the shade outside the palace and looked in the direction of the palace gate. Although she had been doing this for a year, she was completely different from before. The stupidity on her face was gone, and her eyes were full of intelligence. When there was a meaning to waiting, everything suddenly became clear. A few eunuchs and palace maids were standing in the distance. When they saw the little princess smile from time to time, they looked excited. Li Xianzi was really a man of God. He cured the little princess's strange disease that even the imperial doctors couldn't do anything about. They were happy to see the little princesses change these days. It was a pity that Li Xianzi was grounded by His Majesty because he beat the king of Shu. Otherwise, the little princess would definitely smile more. Yongning looked in that direction again, thinking that her brother would not be coming today. She turned around and saw 2 goat horns tied with a bow, as well as the first thing she saw in this world that she was familiar with in her memory. Li Yi saw the surprise in her eyes. He pushed the doll that was as tall as Yongning over and asked with a smile, "Do you like it?" After the little girl came back to her senses, she suddenly pounced forward. However, she did not pounce on the beautiful sheep doll that Li Yi had carefully prepared for her, but Li Yi himself. Looking at the little figure hugging him tightly, Li Yi was stunned for a moment. Then, he lovingly caressed her head. Changda stood behind them, and a trace of doubt appeared on his old face. What he couldn't understand the most was that Princess Yongning was so intimate with Li Yi, even more than His Majesty. Was it because Li Xianzi cured her disease? After this thought came to his mind, he faintly felt that things were not so simple. Humph! When Yongning let go of him and finally focused her attention on the beautiful sheep doll, a cold snort suddenly came from behind Li Yi. The sound was familiar, and so was the scene. Li Yi turned around and saw the proud Lolita standing there with her hands on her hips like a tigress, looking at him with extremely fierce eyes. One should not fall at the same place twice. When Li Yi turned around and dragged out another doll that was almost the same as the previous one from the carriage, but it was bigger than the previous one, and about the same height as Princess Shining. The proud Lolita screamed and pounced on it. Regardless of ancient times or modern times, plush toys, especially large plush toys, had an unparalleled attraction for girls. This was because such large toys could bring them a great sense of security. Of course, the premise was that the girl was really a girl and still retained a young girl's heart. Tomboys and girls' mothers had already broken away from this low-level sense of security and were generally excluded. "Thank you, sir." Princess Shining, who finally recovered from her excitement, immediately pounced on Li. She jumped up and hung on him like a koala and kissed his face. Only then did she realize that the person in front of her was Sir and not her mother. Her little face turned red, and she ran away with her beautiful sheep doll. Ahem! When Li squatted down and whispered to Yongning, Chanda finally could not help coughing twice. Li turned around, looked at him, and said with concern, "Chief Chong, if you're not feeling well, you should go back and rest. Don't worry about me." The chief chamberlain's eyelids twitched, and he forcibly suppressed the surging genuine qi in his body. He said in a low voice, "Li Xianzi, have you forgotten something? What is it?" Li looked puzzled. Crack! The green bricks under Changda's feet were broken. There was still an hour before the second competition with the Qi Kingdom officially began. Hall of Diligent Government. Emperor Jing was high up, and there were more than 10 figures in the hall, including the left and right ministers, the 6 ministers, the capital governor Dong Wenyan, Li Xian, and Mingzu were also in the crowd. Subject Wei, do you think you can win today? Emperor Jing looked at Wei Sai and asked directly. Wei Sai showed a bitter expression and said, "I will do my best." Even Li Xian could tell that Wei Sai was not confident, let alone the old foxes in the court who were good at reading people's expressions. Although he said he would do his best, Wei Sai obviously did not have the confidence to win today's competition. However, to the emperor and the ministers of the Jing Kingdom, they did not want Wei Sai to do his best. They wanted to win, and they had to win. Wei Sai should know the significance of this competition for us. Prime Minister Qin suddenly said, and looked at him, "I only have one question. What are your chances of winning?" Wei Sai thought for a long time, and then said with difficulty, 30%. The hearts of the people in the hall also sank when they heard Wei Sai's words. 30% was not a number they expected. After all, they wanted 100%. However, after the poetry demon Wang Zhong admitted defeat, Wei Sai was their most capable person. If even Wei Sai only had a 30% chance of winning, the others might not even have a 10% chance of winning. As for the so-called scholars of the younger generation in the capital, in their eyes, the poems of those people were just children's tricks and should not be taken seriously. That person is not even 30 years old. Is he really that good? Emperor Jing asked with a frown. The old man next to Prime Minister Qin stepped forward and said, "Your Majesty, Zhao Xuan is very famous in the Qi Kingdom, and he is known as the first poet in 1,000 years. Although this is exaggerated, it is enough to show his talent, and talent, in the way of poetry, is often more important than hard work." Hearing Prime Minister Shun's words, the dozen or so officials in the court felt very depressed. Why did they have to meet such a rare freak of 1,000 years? Why did the Jing Kingdom not have such a freak? Dong Wenyan's lips moved. He wanted to say that everyone, including His Majesty, had neglected one person. As the former magistrate of Qing, he knew the boy's talent. Did they really think that Su Xuejing's evaluation of him as the first scholar of the Jing Kingdom was a joke? However, Wei Sai was still there, and in front of so many officials, it was not good for him to say these words. Emperor Jing sighed helplessly and said, "Could it be that in this big capital, there is really no one who can beat that Zhao? Your Majesty, Li Xianzi has arrived, and he is waiting with Princess Yongning outside the hall." Just as Emperor Jing's voice fell, Changda walked in from outside and said loudly, Chapter 465. Seeing Li Yi holding Yongning's hand and walking in from outside. Emperor Jing was a little depressed. His daughter was even more intimate to an outsider than herself. For a father, this was not something to be happy about. However, thinking that if it wasn't for Li Yi, her soullessness would not be cured. He was afraid that he would not be able to hear her call him Imperial Father until he died. He felt much better. Yongning, come to Imperial Father. Emperor Jing waved to Yongning with a pleasant face. The little girl looked up at Li Yi and then walked up a small steps. Li Xian leaned over and whispered, "Didn't you say that you were not interested in these things? Why are you here again?" Li Yi glanced up and did not speak. If it wasn't for the person above, he would still be busy catching sheep on the green grassland. How would he have time to care about these things? Li Xian did not have a chance to say a second sentence to Li Yi. Dong Wenyun walked over and whispered, "This time, I recommended you to His Majesty. Tell me the truth. What do you think of Zhao Xiuwen of the Qi Kingdom compared to you?" Only then did Li Yi know why he was suddenly summoned to the palace during his confinement. It turned out that he was betrayed by this guy. After all, they came from the same place. Wouldn't his conscience hurt if he betrayed his hometown? Li Yi did not answer Dong Wenyun, because after Emperor Jing let Princess Yongning sit down next to him, he directly asked Li Yi, "This is urgent. I will not say more. I just want to ask you one thing. If I let you participate in today's competition, what are your chances of winning?" Hearing Emperor Jing's words, Wei Sai raised his head. Prime Minister Qin also seemed to think of something. Dong Wenyun's eyes turned slightly. The rest of the people's faces were a little stunned. Was His Majesty going to let this Li Xianzi participate in the second competition? This poem, I actually only know a little about it. Li Yi was taken aback when he heard that. He said slowly, "Moreover, writing poems and lyrics depends on the state and mood of the moment. There's no such thing as confidence. Young Li is right." Old General Shui, who had been dozing off while leaning against the pillar, finally opened his eyes. He waved his hand and said, "Isn't it just 2 poems? What's there to compare? I just feel that whatever best poet wrote was bullsh *t. Who dares to object?" Li Yi deeply agreed with this. As expected of old General Shui, this was the domineering attitude that a large country should have. No matter how good Zhao Xiuwen's poems were, this was the Jing Kingdom. This was their territory. If anyone dared to say that Wei Sai's poems were not as good as Zhao Xiuwen's, they could just drag him out and bury him. Wouldn't everyone's opinion be the same? What was the point of making things so troublesome? Qin Xiang frowned, as if he was too lazy to discuss this matter with old General Shui, so he simply kept his mouth shut. All the civil officials had bitter smiles on their faces. Since ancient times, there was no first in literature. Everyone had their preferences. Old General Shui's words seemed reasonable. But did he think that all the civil and military officials in the imperial court, including the emperor, were as shameless as him? General Shui's words are wrong. If it were true, then wouldn't our Jing Kingdom become the laughingstock of all the other countries? The Minister of Rights, an old man with white hair, said with a frown, "Let's see who dares to laugh." Old General Shui glared, and the Minister of Rights swallowed back his words. Jing Di patted Yongning's head. Seeing the atmosphere in the hall become chaotic again, he rubbed his chest and felt suffocated again. In the end, he did not sleep enough in the morning. Li yawned and prepared to take advantage of their discussion to close his eyes and take a nap. Suddenly, he felt someone tugging on his sleeve. Emingzu walked to his side and looked at him. She said, "We cannot lose today. Be more serious. I know you have a way. Keep a low profile. Keep a low profile." Li Yi stretched out his hand and gestured for her to lower her voice. Old General Shui's way was the best way. Fists were the hard way. If they were not convinced, they could fight. If the Qi Kingdom was really powerful, they could eat a few divine punishment pills first. When you beat up the king of Shu, did you think about keeping a low profile? And Mingzu glanced at him and said, I thought about it," Li Yi said hesitantly. If he had not thought about keeping a low profile at that time, the officials would not have seen County Magistrate Li beating up the king of Shu, but County Magistrate Li killing the king of Shu. County Magistrate Chong and Li Yi, follow me. Jingdi suddenly stood up and pointed at Li Yi. After he finished speaking, he walked towards the back of the palace. Li Yi was startled for a moment. He looked at Li Xian and then at Li Mingzhu. Seeing that they were also puzzled, he could only follow them in confusion. Behind the Hall of Diligent Government was the garden that Li Yi often visited. When Li Yi followed Changde to the garden, he saw Jingdi standing in the stone pavilion in the garden. Is there really no chance of winning? Jingdi looked back at him and asked. It's difficult. Li Yi sighed and said. Jingdi's face showed a trace of thinking, and then he said, I heard from Xian that you want to take Yongning out of the palace? Although he did not know why the old emperor suddenly mentioned this, Li Yi's eyes lit up and he said, Yes, the atmosphere in the palace is too depressing, and it is not suitable for Princess Yongning's treatment. If her soullessness relapses, even I can do nothing. Yongning is a princess of country. Her status is so noble. How can she easily leave the palace? Jingdi shook his head and said, Even if I agree, the officials in the court will not agree, nor will the censors. A trace of helplessness appeared on Li Yi's face. Of course, he knew this. It was not so easy for a young prince to leave the palace. If something happened to him, it would cause a huge shock in the entire capital. Yongning was too young now. No one, from the emperor to the court officials, would agree to her leaving the palace. He was just thinking about it. If you win this competition, I will allow you to take Yongning out of the palace for a month, but her range of activity is limited to 10 miles around the Viscount's residence. Hearing Jingdi's words, Li Yi's expression froze. The light in his eyes soared. He suddenly raised his head and asked, Your Majesty, are you serious? How sure are you now? Jingdi did not expect that he had changed so much. After a moment of shock, he looked at him and asked with a faint smile. Li Yi's eyes flashed fiercely. Your Majesty, how do you want them to die? I am really a failure as an emperor. I have to rely on the help of the children again and again. The first 2 times it was Han, and this time it is Yongning. Jingdi's face was no longer worried, and he said with a teasing smile, Your Majesty, this boy is too outrageous. Can't he take the initiative to stand up and share the burden for your Majesty? Changde, who had always been indifferent, showed a rare trace of anger on his face. If your Majesty did not bring out Princess Yongning this time, I don't know how long he would hide. Isn't the result the same? Jingdi smiled and said disapprovingly. Chapter 466. What did my father say to you just now? When they came out of the Hall of Diligent Government, they saw Li Yi holding Yongning's hand and humming a light and nameless tune. It was obvious that he was in a good mood. So, Mingzhu walked up to him and asked, You will know when we go to the Hall of Political Integrity. Li Yi replied casually and whispered something in Yongning's ear. The little girl's eyes instantly lit up. Li Mingzhu's expression changed slightly. She instantly understood what he was referring to, and her heart that was hanging in the air finally relaxed. Li Xian's expression was also slightly excited. He immediately looked forward to the competition. This is a serious matter. Your Majesty, please reconsider. County Li is indeed talented in mathematics, but today's competition can't be treated as a child's play. Your Majesty, please take back your order. We can't lose again. Hearing the news just announced by Emperor Jing, several high-ranking officials in the imperial court changed their expressions and stepped forward to persuade him. They had long been accustomed to Li Yi's ability to surprise him at the critical moment. How could they not know that Li Yi was 100% confident when they saw his expression just now? At this moment, they didn't bother to explain to the officials. They waved their hands and said, I have made up my mind. You don't need to say more. It's almost time. Follow me to the Hall of Political Integrity. Your Majesty, several officials still wanted to say something, but Emperor Jing had already walked out of the hall. Your Majesty, you are too hasty. Could it be that County Li's attainments in poetry are higher than Wei Sai's? I'm afraid that he will lose today. The minister of the Ministry of Rights said, with a worried expression. A trace of despair even appeared on the faces of the officials behind him. How could a young man in his 20s compare with Wei Sai, who had studied poetry for decades? His Majesty's momentary play would make the Jing kingdom pay a heavy price. Wei Sai, on the other hand, didn't show any disappointment or anger. Instead, he seemed relieved. After all, in a situation where he would lose more than he would win, he would also have a lot of psychological pressure. Of course, it would be good if he won, but if he lost, Ma Zhongxin would be an example to him. He would be reviled by the people of the capital and even the entire Jing kingdom. Just the thought of it was frightening. If it was not necessary, who would be willing to bet their reputation on this match? That Li Xianzi was still too young, and youthful vigor often came at a great price. It was rare that Prime Minister Qin didn't express any opinion on this matter. Among the people present, even Dong Wenyun didn't know County Magistrate Li better than him. If even Wei Sai did not have the confidence to win, then His Majesty's decision was probably the most correct one. The Hall of Legislative Affairs was where all the officials attended the morning court. However, from yesterday onwards, the morning court session was no longer the most important activity of the Hall of Legislative Affairs. There was nothing more important than winning the contest against the Qi Kingdom. More than 10 core officials and Emperor Jing were discussing important matters in the Hall of Legislative Affairs, while the others were waiting outside the Hall of Legislative Affairs. When Li Yi and the others arrived, there were already many people outside the hall. It was not time yet, so the doors of the hall were not opened. When the three of them walked to a secluded corner with few people, Li Xian, who had been talking to Mingzu in a low voice, suddenly froze. Then he walked to the side with a happy expression, patted a young man's shoulder, and said in surprise, "Brother, we meet again." The young man turned his head and looked a little surprised. When he saw Li Xian, he showed a puzzled expression. Soon he understood and said, "You are the one from the Jadeite courtyard." Li Yi and Mingzu walked over. When he saw the young man, he was also a little surprised. Last time in the Jadeite courtyard, because there were no seats, Li Xian took the initiative to share a table with him. Although they didn't talk much, Li Yi had a good impression of him. It was indeed surprising to meet him in the imperial palace this time. "Why are you here?" Li Xian looked at him and asked curiously, "Are you also an official of the imperial court? Why haven't I seen you before?" The young man was speechless and didn't know how to answer. Mingzu looked at Li Xian in surprise. The crowd in the distance looked over, and there was also a small commotion. Li looked at the young man and the people behind him. He turned his head and looked around. Seeing the expressions on the officials' faces, he thought to himself, "It can't be such a coincidence, can it? The third prince of the Qi kingdom?" Li looked at him and asked uncertainly. At this special time, he was excluded by the officials of the Jing kingdom. These people clearly saw him as their leader. Other than the famous third prince, there seemed to be no one else. "Brother Li, we meet again." The young man smiled and cupped his hands in salute to them. Li Xian was stunned and didn't recover from his surprise for a moment. Li Yi saluted the young man and pulled on Li Xian's sleeve, pulling him to another place. This was not a suitable occasion to get close to the young man. The person with them seems to be the eldest princess of the Jing kingdom. "Do you know them, third prince?" After Li Yi and the other two left, an old man came up and asked. The young man smiled and said, "I've met them once. They are two interesting people." He didn't continue on this topic and asked, "The second round of the competition is about to begin. Brother Xiuwen, are you ready?" The other young man leaned against a pillar and was engrossed in a book. He didn't answer. The third prince of the Qi kingdom shook his head. The poetry addict was indeed a poetry addict. On the other side, Mingzu looked at Li Yi and Li Xian suspiciously. Before she could ask the question in her heart, there was a sudden commotion. Not far away, Jing Di, accompanied by Xiang Qin and the others, slowly walked over. The officials looked excited and followed Jing Di into the main hall. The third prince of the Qi kingdom looked at the young man behind him and said, "Let's go." The young man stood up and closed the book in his hand. He looked in the direction of the main hall and smiled. I hope today's competition will be interesting. The court was strangely quiet. It wasn't because they were worried that the noise would affect the competition, but because of the decision His Majesty had just announced. The candidate for this competition was not Wei Sai, but Li Xianzi. His Majesty's actions had undoubtedly killed off their last glimmer of hope before the competition even began. If the envoy of the Qi Kingdom was not in the hall, the Golden Hall would have been in chaos. The crowd looked at Li Yi with confusion, pity, and even resentment. But no matter what kind of emotion they had no hope for the result of today's competition. Li Xianzi, an imperceptible light flashed in the eyes of the third prince of the Qi Kingdom, but it quickly disappeared. As for the young man, he looked slightly regretful. He waited for the third prince to draw a stick from a bamboo tube. When he saw the word dusk on it, he closed his eyes and pondered. Naturally, this poetry competition would not be free to express themselves. There were dozens of sticks in the bamboo tube, with different contents written on them, such as expressing one's feelings and expressing one's feelings. Whichever one was drawn, the two would use it as the topic and compose a poem respectively. Comparing similar poems, it would naturally be easier to distinguish who was better. Of course, everyone had their own style of poetry. In order to eliminate chance and ensure fairness, 3 lots would be drawn for this competition. The moment the young man closed his eyes, Li Yi had already walked to the table and dipped his brush in ink. Under the shocked expressions of the officials and the envoy of the Qi Kingdom, he wrote decisively. So fast. Could it be that he was prepared? That's not possible. The stick was drawn by the third prince of the Qi Kingdom. Before this, no one knew the topic unless, cough, cough. Lord Zhu, be careful with your words. The officials seemed to have thought of something in their shock. Their expressions became strange. They looked at each other and then returned to normal. When the envoy of the Qi Kingdom saw this, he naturally thought of something. The expression on his face became somewhat uncertain. Only the third prince's expression was indifferent. When he had drawn the lots, he had already checked them carefully. Every single lot had a different content written on it. Unless he had prepared dozens of excellent poems that could surpass Zhao Xuan's within a day. But that was simply impossible. At this time, he did not care about the poems. He was thinking about something else. His gaze on Li Yi became deeper. After a while, Li Yi put down his brush. Immediately, a eunuch came forward and posted the poem he had written on the paper. At this time, Zhao Xuan of the Qi Kingdom had not opened his eyes. The officials naturally looked over at him. They were first shocked by the elegant semi-cursive script. It was said that the county magistrate of Chong and had great attainments in calligraphy at such a young age. At this moment, they realized that the rumors were true. It must be said that at this moment, a glimmer of hope was ignited in the hearts of the officials. Then, when they read the poem, their hope was mercilessly extinguished again. It's not easy to reach such a level in such a short time. It's also an excellent piece of work. But it's a pity, among the hundreds of officials in the imperial court, aside from the military generals, those who could be called civil officials were all outstanding individuals. Even if they weren't like Wei Sai, who had spent his entire life studying poetry, how could they not have profound attainments in poetry? Not to mention that they had prepared in advance. If they had really improvised on the spot, it was rare to be able to write such a poem in such a short time. At least, most of them could not do it. But the person in front of him had the title of the best poet in a millennium. If it was only to this extent, it was impossible for him to beat him. Looking at the official's size, Jing Emperor's expression did not change. After glancing at Li Yi, he found that he was talking to Yong Ning in a low voice. He felt more at ease. At this moment, Zhao Xuan finally opened his eyes. He walked to his table, picked up his brush, and dipped it in ink. The official's hearts also twisted. He looked up at the poem that had been posted. His eyes lit up because of the handwriting. Then he shook his head and lowered his head to write. After a moment, Zhao Xuan looked up again. This time, the brush in his hand could no longer fall. You're tuning into the Romance Rendezvous YouTube channel. We're so grateful for your support, and don't forget to subscribe to join us on this incredible journey through captivating stories. Your generosity through donations truly makes a world of difference, as it's the primary source of revenue that allows me to expand and enhance this channel for you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for being a part of this adventure.